Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of our story. If you like this what if story and want to see part 2, let me know in the comments below. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Also, check the description for more great content and my playlist. This story was posted by 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚 fangirl on Wattpad. Now let's start. It was a peaceful Sunday morning at 6 o'clock. And a hyper-energetic 5-year-old with a mop of viridian curls and matching eyes was bursting with excitement as he waited to wake his parents. The boy paused in the living room to check the small clock on the mantel. He decided that 6:03 was an appropriate time and dashed toward his parents' room, skidding to a halt in front of the door. He reached up to the handle, opened it, and burst into the room, exclaiming about the special day ahead. His mother turned to face him, taking a deep breath, while his father groaned at the thought of getting up. The boy urged them to rise, reminding them that today was the day he would find out what his quirk was. His mother, still drowsy, acknowledged him and yawned, realizing how early it was. She reminded him that they had time before the appointment, but he was determined to get them out of bed. With a sigh, she suggested he set the table while she got ready to cook breakfast. Izuku eagerly agreed and sprinted off to the dining room. He carefully arranged 3 plates on the table, each on its respective placemat. He ran back and forth, carrying cutlery and mugs, 2 with his parents' initials and his favorite All Might-themed mug, making sure to handle them one at a time to avoid breaking anything. Proud of his work, he stood back just as his mother emerged from her room, fully dressed. She praised him for his efforts but reminded him that he still needed to get dressed before breakfast. Realizing he was still in his pajamas, he nodded and dashed to his room to change. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐬𝐚 shook her head at her son's enthusiasm before starting to mix the ingredients for his favorite breakfast, strawberry chocolate chip pancakes. About 15 minutes later, Izuku joined his father at the dining room table, swinging his legs as he waited for his mother. His father listened to Izuku's excited chatter about All Might until 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐚 returned with a stack of pancakes and a bowl of strawberries. They expressed their gratitude and dug into the delicious meal. As the clock read 7:30 a.m., 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐚 instructed Izuku to stay in his room until it was time to leave, handing him an iPad. Izuku rushed to his bedroom, closed the door, and jumped onto his bed. He eagerly searched for his favorite video, All Might's debut, and recited the hero's words from memory. Noticing some details he had missed before, he pulled out his analysis notebook and scribbled down his observations in bright blue ink. This notebook was dedicated to All Might, whose merchandise covered every inch of Izuku's room. He also had other notebooks filled with information on different heroes and blueprints for support items he hoped to create when he was older. Time flew by, and soon it was time for Izuku's appointment. His mother called for him, and he sprang into action, rushing down the hallway and slipping on his shoes before sprinting out the door. His parents followed closely behind, amused to find him already in the car, buckled up and ready to go. Excitedly, Izuku asked his father what quirk he might get, wondering if it would be like his or his mother's. Hisashi chuckled, suggesting it could be a mix of both, and they would just have to wait and see. Izuku's imagination ran wild with possibilities, including the idea of pyrokinesis, which he thought would be super cool. After a short drive, the family arrived at the doctor's office about 10 minutes early. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐚 and Hisashi chatted while Izuku stood mesmerized in front of a fish tank, watching the colorful marine life swim around. An announcement came through the speakers, calling the Midoriyas for their appointment. Izuku practically skipped down the hallway with his parents to the office. Dr. 𝗬𝗓𝗧 greeted them and explained that they would conduct a few tests to determine Izuku's quirk. The boy nodded eagerly, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. The doctor proceeded with the necessary tests, including drawing some of Izuku's BLD and preparing him for an X-ray, as the boy's excitement continued to build for what was to come. Half an hour later, the results of the test arrived. Izuku smiled widely, anticipation coursing through him as the doctor entered the room, holding an X-ray and a couple of sheets of paper. The doctor informed Mr. and Mrs. Midoriya that their son, Izuku, was actually quirkless. He pointed to the X-ray, explaining that Izuku had 2 joints in his pinky toe, similar to roughly 20% of the population. Based on the available research, he concluded that Izuku would not be developing a quirk. Izuku's heart sank. It felt as if his entire world was crumbling. How could he be quirkless? After a moment of silence, Izuku managed to gather his thoughts. He recalled his analysis of Eraserhead, the underground hero who fought without a quirk. Perhaps he could do the same. The doctor suggested that it might be best for Izuku to consider a different career path, which confused him. Why did he need to choose another path? He glanced at his parents, whose smile seemed more forced than before. Inko and Hisashi nodded, listening to the doctor's further advice, while Izuku shut it out, lost in thought. Suddenly, he felt his father's hand gripping his wrist, pulling him out of the office with surprising force. "Dad, that hurts," he murmured, but Hisashi only tightened his grip, whispering coldly for him to be quiet. Izuku complied, having never seen his father act this way. Had he done something wrong? Hisashi shoved him into the back of the car, and a heavy silence filled the air as they drove home, the tension palpable. Izuku curled up in his seat, feeling uncomfortable and repeatedly questioning what he had done wrong. Was it because he was quirkless? That wasn't his fault. Tears threatened to spill as he realized this was the only explanation for his father's behavior. Why couldn't he have been born with a quirk like everyone else? The car screeched to a sudden halt, jolting Izuku from his thoughts. Looking out the window, he saw they were already home. He began to undo his seatbelt to climb out, only to find the doors locked. He was about to ask his dad to unlock the car when he noticed his parents were gone. On the steering wheel, he found a note that read, "You took too long getting out of the car, so you'll have to wait until we need to leave for work in the morning. You're lucky we left the window open for you. Now don't cause trouble, quirkless brat." It was signed by his father. Peering into the house through the window, Izuku could see the faint silhouettes of his parents, confirming they had indeed left him there. Thankfully, the window was slightly ajar in case it got hot later, but it wouldn't help if it turned cold. Izuku remained in the car for the rest of the day, fiddling with his hands and using his imagination to escape into worlds where he had been born with a quirk like everyone else, where he could become the #1 hero. Tears streamed down his face as he realized that a few words from a doctor had shattered his dreams. This wasn't fair. As night fell, Izuku eventually cried himself to sleep, curled up in a ball in the far corner of the back seat. Later that night, he awoke to find himself being dragged across the ground by his father. "Dad?" he asked sleepily. Hisashi hissed at him to not call him that. Izuku lowered his head and fell silent as Hisashi pulled him inside and threw him into his bedroom. Hisashi instructed him to address both him and Inko by their names from now on and added that he should keep himself out of their sight, stating that nobody wanted to see his face around there. Satisfied with Izuku's tired expression, Hisashi closed the door and left for work. Izuku sat on the wooden floor of his bedroom, tears pricking at his eyes. Why was this happening? He thought back to his memories of his father and then to the recent events, struggling to reconcile the two. The note his father had left mentioned him being quirkless, confirming that this was all happening because of that. Izuku already knew this, but he didn't want to accept it. He tried to convince himself that his parents had just had a bad day. He got up and sprawled himself over the bed, lost in thought. What could he do now? Could he still become a hero? The question echoed in his mind as he slowly fell back to sleep, tears still rolling down his face. The next morning, Izuku woke up around 6:30 a.m. with dried tear stains on his cheeks and pillow. Rubbing his eyes, he got out of bed and put on his uniform, hoping that yesterday's events had just been a dream. Cautiously, he walked to the dining room, peeking in from behind the door. He saw his mother at the table eating her breakfast. His eyes scanned the table, finding no trace of food for him. He sighed, confirming that this was indeed reality, not a dream or a figment of his imagination. It was real life. Izuku left and headed back to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water and grabbing an apple from the bowl of fruit on the counter. He returned to his room, holding the fruit and the glass, placing them on his desk before opening his laptop to begin his research. He typed into the search bar, wondering if a quirkless person could become a hero. As he took a bite from the apple, he clicked on link after link, receiving the same answer repeatedly. No, hero work would be too dangerous for the quirkless, and they were better off choosing a different career path. The phrasing varied from article to article, but they all conveyed the same message: it was impossible. The 5-year-old felt heartbroken. What child wouldn't be if their dreams had just been completely shattered? Looking up at his alarm clock, he noticed he had 5 minutes until his mom would be dropping him off at school. Taking the apple core and empty glass with him, he sprinted out of his bedroom, depositing the glass in the sink and the core in the garbage before slipping on his shoes. He ran outside only to find his mother wasn't waiting for him in the car. Izuku went back inside and discovered his mother had returned to bed. Drowsily, she informed him that he would be walking to school from now on. He should have known. He nodded before closing her bedroom door and walking back to the front door. Setting off on his walk, Izuku realized he would be late to school, as it took a good 20 minutes to reach the school by car and around 30 on foot. With school starting in 23 minutes, even in the car, he would be cutting it close. He walked with his head down, avoiding others on their morning commutes, muttering to himself about what 𝐒𝐮𝐸𝐽 would think and what everyone else would think. After 25 more minutes of walking, he finally reached the school gates, albeit 5 minutes late. He rushed inside, running through the corridors to reach his classroom. Bursting into the classroom, he was relieved to see that his teacher had yet to arrive. He let out a sigh of relief before walking over to his desk in the second-to-last row. A couple of kids looked as if they were about to approach him, likely curious about how his appointment had gone. Panic set in as he wondered what they would do when they found out he was quirkless. Based on his parents' reactions, it wouldn't be good. Doing his best to avoid eye contact, he reached into his backpack, pulling out a book to pretend to read. This seemed to convey that he wasn't looking to talk, and everyone left him alone. 2 minutes later, their teacher walked in, apologizing for her lateness before beginning to call everyone's names. After checking attendance, she beckoned him to the front of the classroom. As everyone knew, Izuku had gone to the quirk doctor yesterday. He clenched his hands into fists and bit down on his tongue, fighting back tears. The teacher asked him how it went and what quirk he had. Shuffling a bit, he finally managed to whisper that he was quirkless. The teacher and the students clearly didn't hear him, confusion washing over their faces. She prompted him to speak up, and he repeated that he was quirkless. After school, Izuku trudged out of the building, shivering uncontrollably, mostly due to the full bottle of milk that 𝐒𝐿 had poured over his head as he left. It had not been a good day at school. Everyone had avoided him, and when they didn't, it was mostly to insult him or to push him around. Quirkless really seemed to be just another word for useless to them, he thought to himself. His walk home was uneventful, aside from receiving a few strange looks due to his soaked uniform. Upon arriving at his house, he opened the door and walked inside. He made sure to be quiet when he saw his parents sitting in the lounge, sliding off his shoes and running off to his room before they could see him. Today had certainly been different. A month later, Izuku sat at his desk in silence, his blueprint notebook laid out before him with a pencil in hand as he worked on plans for a voice changer. After finishing the drawing, he began writing a list of parts he would need, along with instructions on how to build it, including their own pictures. Izuku was no fool. He wrote all of his blueprint work and analysis in a code he had created last year to keep the information safe from anyone who might have different intentions. While writing, he listened to his parents' conversation, catching snippets of his name mentioned multiple times. He tried to push thoughts of what they might be discussing out of his head, focusing instead on his work. He took his blueprint notebook and hid it in the broken panel of his cupboard above the desk. His parents had not reacted well to seeing his analysis and blueprint books lately. The last time he left them out, he had to rewrite everything into a new book. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Izuku reached into the cupboard, pulling out his textbooks, which any normal child wouldn't have seen until they were about 5 years older. He also grabbed a half-filled notebook to take notes in. As he began to write, he waited, trembling with anticipation for 𝐻𝐼𝐶 to burst into his room as he had for the past month, resulting in punishment. However, Izuku had discovered that if his father found him studying, he was usually less harsh. The first time it happened, he had been watching a video on his laptop, and his ankle had been injured. His parents forbade him from returning to school after the incident, fearing that a teacher would question it and have them report it. They kept him locked in the house, allowing him out only for meals, where he would cook for himself and them on the days he was allowed to eat. They didn't take him to a doctor, instead tossing him a roll of bandages and a first aid kit, telling him to avoid making a mess. Izuku knew they disliked the sight of his injured foot, which was swollen and bruised, and it seemed as if half the bones were missing at first glance, considering a 5-year-old had patched it up. He managed to treat himself reasonably well, thanks to a first aid book he had borrowed from the library last year, so he avoided infection. It took a while to heal as he was forced to do housework and cook, unable to use anything as a crutch. He limped around, putting pressure on the broken bones several times, which slowed the healing process. Fortunately, after about 2 weeks, he was completely healed, although it would have taken longer without the unnecessary aggravation. Izuku sat at his desk studying for the next 2 hours, but Hisashi never came that night. Confused but relieved, Izuku assumed his father had fallen asleep early. Without any fresh bruises or cuts to tend to, he curled up on his blanket in the corner, ready to sleep. His parents had sold his bed weeks ago, believing that a quirkless child deserved to sleep on the floor. Still, they had been considerate enough to give him a blanket, which was provided so he wouldn't get dirt on the floor. Hisashi claimed he didn't want anyone else to catch his disease. The next morning, Izuku woke suddenly to the sound of his door creaking open. He felt a hand grab his wrist, a habit he had developed from waking at the slightest movement due to Hisashi's tendency to drag him out of bed at 5 in the morning. He assumed he was about to receive the beating he had missed earlier, as it was nowhere near the usual time for his father to wake him. Hisashi walked past the door to his study, which confused Izuku. Usually, if he were to receive punishment, it would be in there or in his own bedroom. What was Hisashi doing with him? The question lingered in his mind as he was dragged to the front door. Hisashi dropped him by the door, growling for him to stay put before walking off. Izuku complied and noticed his school bag, filled with supplies, and his shoes, which were not in their usual spot. His mind raced through various possibilities when Hisashi returned, holding one of his notebooks, obviously chosen at random. He told Izuku to take the bag and his shoes and get out, stating that he would not be welcome for the next 5 days. Hisashi continued, saying he would burn the hero books once he found them. Izuku froze. As far as his father knew, he had destroyed his notebooks. Hisashi was kicking him out for that. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted as Hisashi threw him out the door, along with the backpack, shoes, and notebook, slamming the door behind him. It was important to know that although Hisashi utterly despised his son, he couldn't bear to be the parent of a child he deemed foolish. He forced Izuku to study daily, as it was the only thing other than chores he was allowed to do. He often had Izuku showcase his knowledge when friends visited, wanting to appear as a great parent despite his harsh treatment. Izuku put the notebook in his bag and slung it over his shoulder. Quickly slipping on his shoes, he ran down the drive, tears welling in his eyes. He soon found himself in a nearby park. It was cold and dark, and he wished he could return home. Though it was horrible, at least it was warm. Sitting on a nearby bench, Izuku shuffled through the bag his father had left for him. It contained only a couple of cereal bars and 2 bottles of water. Killing their son would get them arrested, but breaking him was a different story. As long as it was kept hidden, nobody cared. After all, he was quirkless. Sighing, Izuku curled up on the bench, clutching his few belongings tightly as he fell into a light, uncomfortable sleep. The next 5 days passed quickly, with safety being the only thing on Izuku's mind. He learned his lesson on the first day when he slept on the bench and discovered that half of his food and water had been stolen. Although this worried him, he was grateful that the thief had left him something. How foolish could he have been? A kid sleeping outside on a bench with nothing but a backpack was practically asking to be robbed. He slept under a bush for the remainder of his time in the park, hiding his belongings from potential thieves and those desperate for food on the streets. It was necessary for his survival. On the 5th morning, Izuku stumbled back home, feeling faint from hunger and dehydration. Covered in dirt, it was evident he hadn't showered in days, as the smells from the park clung to him. However, upon arrival, he found a bright red sign on the front of his house that read, "For sale." Izuku's mouth fell open as he rushed inside to investigate further. The house was empty. There were no photos of his parents' wedding or anniversaries on the mantel, the table was gone, and so were the kitchen utensils. Even the bedrooms were completely cleared out, except for Izuku's. Most of his clothes had disappeared, along with many of his belongings. However, there was a note on the wall that seemed to be addressed to him. It stated that his parents had decided to move elsewhere and that people would be moving in on Monday, urging him to leave by then. It mentioned that his notebooks were waiting for him in their bedroom, but the note concluded with a cruel remark, suggesting he should not burden anyone else. Izuku couldn't bring himself to cry. He should have felt overwhelmingly upset, but instead he felt a strange sense of acceptance, as if he had known this would happen eventually. He quickly made his way to his parents' bedroom to retrieve his notebooks. Upon opening the door, he found a small pile of ashes on a sheet of white paper with a note that read, "You're welcome." He should have known that his father would never do something kind. Wiping the tears from his eyes, he hurried to the bathroom and used the shower, cleaning it as best as he could with one of his old shirts. He grabbed a change of clothes his parents had left in his wardrobe and stuffed them into his bag before leaving the building he had once called home. Left to wander the streets aimlessly, Izuku was all alone. 8 years later, in a dark, damp alleyway, the story continued. A young boy with dyed purple hair, dressed in all black with a mask tucked into his left pocket, crouched behind a stack of crates, shivering from the cold. He winced slightly as he removed a bullet from his side. This wasn't the first time he had been injured. By the age of 13, he had already become one of Japan's most sought-after vigilantes, currently hiding away to allow his injuries to heal. This boy was Izuku Midoriya. Taking out a first aid kit he had stashed away not long ago, Izuku began stitching up his side, feeling little pain as he worked. In truth, he felt numb, but the thrill of being a vigilante brought him a rush of adrenaline and pride every time he thwarted a criminal or saved an innocent person. After securing the stitches as best he could with limited supplies, Izuku curled up behind the crates to sleep. Although uncomfortable, the crates provided a small amount of shelter, keeping him hidden from criminals and others who might spot him. He was often haunted by nightmares, but his hypervigilance ensured he remained alert even in his sleep. The ground beneath him was moist, but he had slept in worse conditions. Despite the bullet wound and stitches, Izuku managed to sleep for 3 hours, waking up at 6 a.m. to scavenge for food people had discarded. As he walked down the street, keeping an eye out for anything edible, he came across a young boy throwing a tantrum, upset with his mother over a box of off-brand cereal. Eventually, the frustrated mother tossed the box into a nearby alley. Seizing the opportunity, Izuku darted over to grab the box before returning to his own alley as quickly as possible. Setting the box down, he jumped up and down with joy, realizing it could last him for weeks if he was careful. After munching on a handful, he stashed the box in one of the crates and went to use the public restroom in a nearby park. Once finished, he returned to his alley and began mapping out his patrol route with a tattered map he had found discarded. He planned to venture into the crime-stricken area of West Muzudafu later that night after finishing his cleaning at Dagoba Beach. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the entrance of the alley. Izuku froze for a moment before quickly hiding behind the crates, pulling out a rusty knife for defense. Someone was approaching and he held his breath, ready for whatever might come next. Izuku had tried to venture into the alley many times after closing up, but he had never found anyone there. This time, however, he was certain he saw a small figure dart behind the crates as he approached. It could have been a short child or perhaps a large animal. He reached into his bag, pulling out a box of cakes that he hadn't sold at work, and placed it on the ground near the entrance to the alleyway. He called out, offering the treats, and backed away slightly. A young boy, appearing to be around 13 or 14 years old, cautiously peeked around the corner. He stood about 5 feet tall, with matted purple hair and a few green roots showing through. As the boy crept out from behind the crates, he glanced between Izuku and the box before snatching it and retreating further down the alley. Izuku felt a sense of relief that the boy accepted the food, but questions lingered in his mind about who this child was. Although Izuku didn't fully trust the woman, he sensed that she meant no harm when she offered him food. The box was sealed and looked untouched, and her kind, warm eyes compelled him to trust her. He grabbed the cakes and quickly ran back to his previous spot, still cautious. He hadn't eaten anything like this since before he visited the quirk doctor at 5 years old. The woman stood there, contemplating her next move. She called out to him, suggesting he come to her coffee shop for a proper drink and more food, noting that he looked like he needed it. Izuku hesitated but eventually stumbled toward her. She observed his disheveled appearance and felt a pang of sympathy for him. Reaching out her hand, he took it, allowing her to lead him to the cafe. After a 10-minute walk, they arrived at a small, cozy cafe. The woman guided Izuku inside and seated him at one of the many chairs. She informed him that she would fetch a drink and some food, and he nodded in response. She disappeared behind the counter and returned 15 minutes later with a mug of hot chocolate and some quickly made sandwiches. To most, the food might have seemed unremarkable, but to Izuku, it appeared as if it had been crafted by a master chef. He eagerly devoured the meal in just a couple of minutes, leaving no crumbs behind. Natalie, the woman, scratched her head as she watched him eat, unsure of what to do next. She had found a homeless child and fed him in her cafe, a situation she had never encountered before. While the thought of calling the police crossed her mind, she quickly dismissed it, realizing that if they were willing to help, he would have been taken off the streets long ago. She pondered her options. As they entered the shop, Izuku noticed a sign in the window indicating that they were looking to hire a new barista. Though he had never made coffee before, he had read extensively on various subjects when he was younger, including a book titled The Art of Brewing, which detailed how to prepare coffee and tea. Gathering his courage, he spoke up, thanking her for the food and asking if he could possibly work there. He stuttered, feeling nervous about speaking to someone outside of his vigilante persona. Natalie paused, considering his request. She asked if he knew how to make coffee, to which he nodded, explaining that while he had never brewed it himself, he understood the process. Skeptical but intrigued, she took him behind the counter and allowed him to demonstrate his skills. To her surprise, the coffee he made tasted even better than what she had been preparing for years. Izuku was hired on the spot, and after some negotiation, Natalie convinced him to live in the apartment above the shop while receiving a wage. Now, Izuku lay sprawled across what was now his bed, reflecting on how he had gone from being a homeless vigilante to having a job and a roof over his head in just a few hours. Izuku disliked the complications that came with his situation. There would be interrogations, investigations, and likely arrests, leading him to the foster care system, complete with a therapist. He believed he didn't need such things, others required them more, and he would only take up their valuable time. Fortunately, Izuku was skilled at fabricating stories. Every mark on his body and every expression needed an explanation. Many had inquired about his scars when he lived on the streets, so he had a backstory prepared for moments like this. In short, he claimed he had survived a villain attack that took his parents' lives the previous year when he was 12. He had lived alone on the streets, surviving on scraps, and he missed his parents dearly. This narrative often moved people to tears, leading to moments where strangers bought him fresh food. Those were the highlights of his life back then. Natalie had heard the same story and understood his reluctance to enter the foster care system. She had seen reports online about the high number of abuse cases within it, particularly affecting quirkless children. It pained her to think that a boy like him should be afraid of a system meant to help kids. That was why she decided to set him up in the apartment above the cafe, despite his protests. She had initially planned to rent it out, but considering the area, she likely wouldn't have found any tenants anyway. Plus, what kind of employer would she be if she allowed her employees to live on the streets? Izuku had also asked her to call him Izuni while he worked in the shop, explaining that he didn't want anyone to recognize him from police reports. It seemed reasonable to Natalie, who hoped she wouldn't slip up at any point. On his first day on the job, Izuku stood nervously in the back of the shop, anxiously twiddling his thumbs as he waited for Natalie to arrive. He had woken up early, prepared himself, and set up the kitchen an hour before his shift started. He wasn't exactly a people person and preferred working in the back rather than at the counter. After all, he was hired to make coffee, not to interact with customers. However, Natalie had insisted he be at the counter while she took her break, believing it would be beneficial for him to gradually get used to interacting with others. When Natalie entered through the front door, she waved enthusiastically at Izuku, who responded with a nervous grin. After changing into her uniform, they opened the shop. Izuku remained in the back for the first hour and a half, making coffee after coffee. Unbeknownst to him, he was creating a fan base as customers raved about his coffee from the main room. Even a grumpy-looking regular had a small grin on his face as he took a sip. Natalie informed Izuku that she was going on break, allowing him to take over the register. She quickly prepared an iced coffee and sat down at 𝗧𝗘𝗧𝗟𝗘 table. 𝗧𝗘𝗧𝗟𝗘 had been a regular since they opened, appreciating the quiet atmosphere and the coffee, which he deemed not bad. A compliment from him. Natalie noticed 𝗧𝗘𝗧𝗟𝗘 looked more irritated than usual and asked if he was okay. He nodded, mentioning some trouble at work with a new vigilante who had appeared about 3 months ago. They had no information on the vigilante, as criminals and victims alike only described them as a black blur. 𝗧𝗘𝗧𝗟𝗘 groaned, resting his head on the table, expressing his frustration about having to catch this mysterious figure during his patrols. On a lighter note, 𝗧𝗘𝗧𝗟𝗘 remarked that the coffee tasted better than usual. Natalie mentioned that they had a new hire, her nephew, who was working at the register. She pointed out Izuku, who looked flustered as he entered orders. Realizing that putting him at the counter on his first day might not have been the best idea, she decided to check on him. As she walked over to Izuku, 𝗧𝗘𝗧𝗟𝗘 observed them, noting how Izuku flinched slightly when Natalie lightly grabbed his wrist. 𝗧𝗘𝗧𝗟𝗘 was intrigued by this new barista, wondering what made his coffee so exceptional. He felt a sense of unease about Izuku, sensing that something was off. As he finished his coffee, he pondered over the boy's secret, determined to uncover what made his coffee so spectacular. Around a year later, Izuku had been experiencing frequent nightmares that left him gasping for breath in the early hours of the morning. One such night, he shot up in bed, hands clutching his throat as he struggled to calm his racing heart. After a moment, he flopped back down, finally managing to steady his breathing. As he glanced at the clock and saw it was 4:29 a.m., he turned it off and got ready for the day. By 5 a.m., he was dressed and made his way down to the cafe below his apartment. For the next hour and a half, he cleaned the cafe, prepped the coffee machine, and checked on the cupcakes and croissants baking in the oven. When the timer went off, he returned to the kitchen, the delightful aroma of baked goods filling the air. He took the treats out of the oven, savoring the smell before placing them on a rack to cool. He then went to the front of the shop and unlocked the doors just as Natalie arrived, looking as if she hadn't slept in weeks. Natalie scolded him for coming in early, insisting he should stop before his shift. Izuku chuckled softly, explaining that if he didn't come in early, they would open much later than usual. He teased her about being lazy in the mornings, which made her pout in response. By 7 a.m., Izuku had decorated the pastries and arranged them in the display case. He felt a sense of pride in his work before heading to the back to prepare coffee for their favorite regular, 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗘𝗧𝗏, who arrived promptly at 7:25 a.m., as he did every day. 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏 approached the register, ordering his usual while handing Natalie a handful of coins. She informed him that Izuku would be over shortly. 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏 pulled out his laptop, reviewing files on a vigilante he had been tracking for nearly 3 years. Frustration washed over him as he realized there was still no new information. When Izuku brought 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏 his coffee, the underground hero expressed his gratitude, calling it the liquid of the gods. Izuku couldn't help but smile at 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏's tired demeanor. Curious about 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏's progress, Izuku asked if there were any updates on the vigilante. 𝗧𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 sighed, explaining that they still had no leads. All they knew was that the vigilante was around 5 feet 1 inch, and it had taken them a month to gather even that much information, as witnesses often only reported seeing a blur of green and black. Izuku felt a mix of relief and irritation. He was actually 5 feet 2 inches and wished he would hit his growth spurt soon. He and Natalie had agreed to tell any customers who asked that he was 16 to avoid questions about working at 14, which was only a couple of years off and seemed believable enough. Though it would be much more believable if he could just grow a little more. Izuku and 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏 sat and chatted for a while longer until 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏 finished his coffee. 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏 grumbled, asking Izuku if he could make him another cup. Izuku nodded, taking the empty cup to prepare the refill. 𝗧𝗧𝗟𝗧𝗏's order was simple, just beans and hot water, but Izuku knew how to bring out the best flavor, making the coffee even stronger for the tired man. After preparing the coffee, Izuku set it down in front of 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, who looked up from his laptop and thanked him, pressing some money into Izuku's hands. Izuku waved goodbye to the hero before leaving to get back to work, depositing the money in the register on his way past. Taking over at the register, Izuku noticed Natalie walking over to 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴's table, holding her iced coffee and a couple of Izuku's cupcakes for them to share. They chatted about normal things, like the time Natalie had accidentally spilled an iced coffee on a group of teenage girls who had been harassing another girl in the shop, until 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 decided to ask her a question. He inquired if she knew what had happened to Izuku, mentioning that she had said he was her nephew. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 continued, expressing his curiosity about the scars on Izuku's arms and hands. Natalie paused at the question, then sighed before replying that she couldn't share everything since it wasn't her story to tell. She explained that Izuku and his parents had been caught up in an incident that resulted in him becoming an orphan, and that he had come to live with her. When she tried to give him pocket money, he refused and insisted on earning it himself. Attempting to lighten the mood, she smiled, but 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 simply nodded, returning to their regular conversation. It seemed perfectly normal to him. No one ever questioned this explanation when Izuku mentioned it. After a while, Natalie's break was over, and she got up from the table, saying goodbye to 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 as she walked back behind the counter to take orders again. About 10 minutes later, Izuku emerged from the back with 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴's coffee in a disposable cup. It was practically routine for them. At 8 o'clock, 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 would get a coffee to go before heading to work. Grabbing a box with an assortment of croissants and cupcakes, Izuku placed them in front of 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, mentioning that Natalie had told him to give some to share with his coworkers. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 smiled and thanked him, saying his fellow staff members would love them before packing away his laptop and trudging out the door. The coffee shop saw quite a few customers throughout the day. By noon, Izuku's cupcakes and croissants had all disappeared from the display case, and he had made another 30 coffees. Parents often came in for their morning coffee with their children, treating them to something sweet to keep them happy. As the clock struck 6 o'clock, marking closing time, Izuku waved goodbye to Natalie as she left through the doors and started on her way home. Closing up the shop was always left to him since he lived upstairs, so he quickly locked the door before heading up to his apartment to get to work. Sitting on his bed with a sigh, he stretched out his aching back before beginning his tasks. He pulled out his vigilante costume from under the mattress along with a sewing kit from the cupboard above his head. The costume bore 3 large slashes across the abdomen and a hole stained with dried blood a little further down. Izuku had 3 partially healed matching gashes across his sternum as well. You might be wondering how this happened. It all began about 3 days ago, on a Friday, which was fortunate since he could barely move around the apartment on Saturday and Sunday. Thankfully, the cafe was closed that weekend while Natalie visited her parents. The injuries came from a situation where he had saved a young boy from a hostage crisis. Izuku stood perched on an apartment complex in the sweet silence of nighttime, listening and watching for those in need of help. That night had been quite slow. The only things he had done were help a child find their mother and assist an elderly woman who had fallen. These small acts were the reasons locals adored him and refused to report him to the police, as heroes often focused on villains rather than helping the public in other ways. Earlier that night, he had prevented a tragedy when he saved a young girl who had been standing on the edge of a rooftop, tears streaming down her face. As she leapt forward, Izuku jumped from his position, catching her mid-air and landing lightly on the ground below, rolling to soften the impact. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at the vigilante holding her, tears streaming down her face. She cried out in anguish, expressing her despair to the sky above, questioning why she couldn't just be allowed to fade away. Izuku gently stroked her hair and pulled her close, muffling her cries as she embraced him in return. After a few minutes, she calmed down, and he released her from the hug. He softly asked her name, and she hesitantly replied, revealing herself to be Aiko. Izuku sat her down on a swing in a nearby park, where they spent the next hour and a half talking. Aiko shared her fears, from the darkness that haunted her to the neglect she felt from her parents. Izuku listened intently, responding when needed, but mostly allowing her to express herself. It filled him with a deep, simmering anger to hear a 7-year-old girl voicing such thoughts. No child should ever feel that way. He realized she needed more than just someone to talk to, she needed protection, someone to save her. Izuku had always vowed to protect those around him. It was his purpose. Once Aiko finished speaking, her face bore a wobbly smile, and her shirt collar was slightly damp from tears. Izuku quickly wrote a note for the police and brought her to the station, crouching down to her level. He reassured her that she would be well cared for and promised that no one would hurt her again. With a gentle ruffle of her hair, he held her hand for a moment before disappearing into the night, leaving the crumpled note in its place. He thought of her bright smile when he had offered her a piggyback ride on the way to the station, the sound of her giggles warming his heart. Suddenly, a scream jolted him back to the present. He swiftly took out his grappling hook and swung from building to building until he reached the source of the commotion. There, he saw a woman trying to shield a young boy, presumably her son, from two attackers who had them cornered in an alleyway. One of the muggers demanded the woman's purse, but she shook her head defiantly, searching for an escape. Just then, a third man emerged from behind her and snatched the boy away. The woman cried out in protest, only to be struck by one of the original attackers, leaving her barely conscious. Izuku assessed the situation, noting the glowing eyes of one attacker and the knives they carried, realizing they were prepared for a fight. The first man warned him to leave, but Izuku knew he had to act. He swung down, positioning himself between the woman and the assailants, pulling her out of harm's way. As he did, he felt a sudden jolt of paralysis wash over him, realizing the first man's quirk had taken effect. The attackers, armed with knives, began to close in. Izuku felt the cold steel slice through his costume and into his flesh, but he pushed through the pain. One of the assailants turned his attention back to the boy, while another continued to attack Izuku, the blade digging deeper with each move. Despite the pain, Izuku focused on the task at hand, determined to protect the innocent. After what felt like an eternity, he regained his mobility and sprang into action, throwing the attacker off him and into the wall. He quickly leaped onto the second attacker, blocking a swing aimed at him and sending the man tumbling to the ground. With swift precision, he incapacitated the second assailant before turning his attention to the last one, who had taken the boy hostage. The final attacker threatened the boy, demanding the woman and the others be handed over. Izuku complied, raising his hands to avoid escalating the situation. He spoke calmly, trying to distract the man while subtly reaching for a smoke bomb in his utility belt. Once he had it, he threw it to obscure the assailant's vision. In the ensuing confusion, the man swung wildly, but soon found himself knocked out on the ground. With the danger momentarily past, Izuku pulled down his mask and knelt beside the young boy, reassuring him that everything would be all right. He explained that he had called the police to help, hoping to calm the child after such a frightening ordeal. The boy gazed up in wonder as the vigilante nodded at him, his tears dampening the hero's costume while he gently stroked the boy's hair. It wasn't long before the police arrived on the scene. The vigilante carefully lifted the boy, helping him stand steady. He encouraged the young boy to go over to the people near the flashing lights, assuring him they would take him somewhere safe. The boy nodded vigorously and ran in the direction he had been directed. With a relieved smile, the vigilante grabbed his grappling hook and soared into the night. Izuku looked down at his once-torn costume, now stitched up and ready for action. He sighed before standing up and pulling on the costume, wincing slightly as the homemade stitches pressed against his torso. Although he had dealt with worse injuries, he needed to ensure everything stayed together until he healed. He had also made the sensible choice to tape his upper body to keep everything firmly in place, even if it restricted his movement. He didn't want to risk anyone's life because he was too stubborn to take care of his wounds properly. He thought to himself about another night of technically questionable activities. Since he hadn't used a quirk, nothing he had done was illegal, aside from possibly confronting a few criminals who hadn't attacked first. That wouldn't land him in serious trouble, just some community service or fines, but nothing too harsh overall. Glancing at his alarm clock, Izuku realized it was already 8:37 p.m. He should have left by now. Mending his costume had taken longer than he expected. He quickly donned his support gear, including a utility belt, a voice-changing mask, and an assortment of weaponry, all crafted from materials he had scavenged from Dagobah Beach. He gazed out the window for a moment before pulling up his mask and leaping into the night. Izuku was equipped with a lot of gear, considering he couldn't just buy it from mechanics. Support items useful in the field were often labeled for heroes, and regular civilians couldn't access such technology without raising suspicion. Most would assume they were using it for vigilantism, and they would be closely monitored. However, Izuku had made all his gear himself, using blueprints he had developed over the years. He had recreated most of his old designs from memory, filling in gaps as he went, and even began crafting new items once he secured a job at the cafe. The materials came from Dagobah Beach, where people often dumped old computers and other trash, taking advantage of the currents that brought in waste from the waters. Izuku occasionally took on the task of cleaning the beach, not only as a way to serve the community but also as an extra workout. He had cleared about half of the beach so far. While cleaning, he kept an eye out for useful items to incorporate into his equipment, knowing that no one else would be using them. As he leaped out of his apartment window, Izuku pulled a grapple gun from his utility belt, aiming and shooting it at the next building on his right. The hook lodged itself into the wall, and after checking its security with a tug, he retracted the gun, pulling himself toward the building. He climbed the rest of the wall until he reached the roof, grinning widely beneath his mask. It had taken him 2 weeks to get the grappling gun working and 2 full days of practice in an alley before he could move around properly with it. He put the grappling gun back into his belt, deciding it would be quicker to keep moving without it since he wasn't fully accustomed to using it yet. The gun was primarily for emergencies, like if he were to fall from a skyscraper. Being homemade, it wasn't as reliable as a professional one, but that didn't stop him from having fun with it. After all, who wouldn't want to swing around like a hero? Suddenly, Izuku caught the sound of hushed voices breaking the tranquil silence of the night. He swiftly and quietly approached the source, discovering what appeared to be a drag deal in progress. He noted 2 men selling and 1 buying. The buyer looked guilty and was slightly trembling as he discussed the price with the sellers. Thankfully, the 2 were in a well-lit area, so Izuku took out a pair of glasses, activating the reading mode he had added to them. This mode displayed the quirks of individuals within his field of vision by scanning their faces or bodies and matching them to the government's database. If they weren't found, the gadget would sift through security footage until they were identified, but he would have to deduce the quirk himself. His glasses, however, weren't always 100% accurate. Certain lighting could distort the camera's view, making identification difficult. Darkness posed the biggest challenge, as a clear look at a person's face was essential for accurate identification. As he observed the quirks of the sellers before him, Izuku decided on his course of action. The first seller could create weapons using carbon from the air, but converting it into usable forms required significant energy, limiting his capabilities. The second seller possessed an ability called Blackout Curtain, which allowed them to create curtains that blended seamlessly into their surroundings, rendering them nearly invisible. The only limitations were that they needed something to anchor the curtains, like the walls of an alley, and they couldn't be suspended from above due to gravity. Izuku noted to himself how useful such a quirk could be for illicit activities. The man purchasing the drags had a minor pyrokinetic ability, which would be of little help in this situation. It was as useful as a small lighter. Izuku dropped down silently from above, landing behind the 2 thugs. They continued their conversation, unaware of his presence. The buyer hesitated, asking how much the drags would cost. The seller replied that around 80,000 yen would suffice. The buyer winced but began to pull out his wallet to pay. Before he could retrieve the money, the 2 dealers were suddenly knocked to the ground. The man looked around in confusion, soon spotting Izuku as he moved the unconscious men aside. Izuku asked the man if he would come with him willingly. The man stood frozen for a moment before nodding, trembling with fear. Izuku inquired why he was buying the drags. The drags enhanced quirks, but even with that, the man's flames were too small to make much difference. The man explained that he was homeless and unable to find work due to how others perceived him as weak because of his quirk. He had decided to turn to illegal activities, planning to invest his last savings into the drags, hoping to resell them for a profit. As he spoke, he began to sob, and Izuku felt a pang of sympathy behind his mask. He wrote a note detailing the situation and warning about the drags the men had been selling, then called the police, leaving the note with the man before disappearing into the night. He specifically mentioned in his note that the man regretted his choices and was homeless, urging the authorities to help him rather than simply incarcerate him. When the police arrived, 𝗬𝗓𝗟 received the note, and the man trusted the vigilante's judgment, given the numerous cases he had successfully resolved. The buyer ended up with a few hours of community service and was offered a job as a receptionist at the police station, along with a place to live. Izuku smiled to himself, knowing he had made the right choice for the man, hoping he would find the support he needed to rebuild his life. Later that night, Izuku had resolved several minor incidents, each taking only a minute or two to de-escalate. However, he soon encountered a more serious situation involving human trafficking. A young girl with light blue hair and bright blue eyes was being dragged through an alleyway by a woman. Her clothes were tattered, leaving her in rags. Izuku grimaced at the sight. The poor child appeared to be no older than 6. The woman paused in the alley, seemingly waiting for someone. It took all of Izuku's restraint not to intervene immediately. He knew it was better to wait and catch both the woman and whoever she was meeting. After about 10 minutes, a man and another woman arrived, holding a large bag. Peeking inside revealed wads of cash hastily stuffed within. The woman asked if the amount would be sufficient, tossing the bag to the other. As she dropped the rope holding the child, she began counting the money. The man commented that the girl would likely be well received, as older individuals often preferred the young. Izuku felt a wave of nausea wash over him during this exchange. He couldn't allow this to continue. Gathering his resolve, he leaped from the building above, landing on the seller and swiftly incapacitating her with a precise strike. He ensured she remained conscious, then turned his attention to the other 2, neutralizing them in the same manner. With all 3 criminals subdued, Izuku realized he might have gone too far. Their faces bore bruises, and they lay unconscious on the ground. He stood up and approached the girl, who looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. Noticing the masks obscuring the criminals' identities, he understood why she might fear him, given his own mask. Against his better judgment, he pulled his mask down to his neck and smiled gently at the girl as he cut her free from the ropes with a knife from his utility belt. Once released, the girl hesitated for a moment before throwing herself into Izuku's arms. He held her tightly, stroking her hair and reassuring her that she would be okay now. Quickly, he removed the hoodie he wore for his vigilante work and draped it over her shoulders. As he zipped it up for her, the girl's face transformed into a teary grin, and she clambered back into his embrace. Izuku began to dial the police using his burner phone, announcing himself as Nightfall to the Mizudafu Police Department and letting them know he had another assignment. He wrapped his arms around the girl again, feeling a sense of comfort in the moment. Suddenly, he sensed a familiar presence above him and turned his head to see a figure standing there, pulling up his mask as he did. He called out, asking who was there and warning that he wouldn't hesitate to defend himself if necessary. Out of the shadows stepped a slightly impressed underground hero, Eraserhead. It took all of Izuku's willpower not to fanboy over finally meeting him during his vigilante hours. Aizawa was out on his usual late patrol at 2 a.m., feeling exhausted and wishing for another cup of coffee. As he ran over a rooftop, he noticed the faint outline of some unconscious figures in an alley. Further down, he spotted a young girl being held by someone in a costume. Aizawa crouched down to observe the situation when the figure below suddenly turned his head in his direction, casually asking who was there and warning him to come out. Aizawa was surprised that the vigilante could still sense him. He stood up and revealed himself, introducing himself as Eraserhead. The vigilante responded, identifying themselves as Nightfall. Aizawa's jaw dropped. He had been pursuing Nightfall for a year without ever catching a glimpse of them. They were using a voice changer and matched the height of the reported victims. In an instant, the vigilante vanished from his sight, causing Aizawa to panic as he searched for them. Just then, he felt the young girl being pressed into his arms. He instinctively dropped his capture weapon to catch her instead. She was soundly asleep, with a piece of paper taped to her hand detailing what had happened. The hoodie she had been wearing, presumably belonging to the vigilante, had disappeared. 𝐼𝐮𝐻𝐼 quickly used his capture weapon to cover her shivering body, puzzled about when Nightfall had found the time to write the note. When he looked up to ask, he realized the vigilante had vanished completely. Izuku let out a sigh of relief as he distanced himself from Eraserhead and slipped into an empty alleyway, overwhelmed with excitement. He had just met Eraserhead in his full vigilante outfit. This encounter felt different from their previous meetings, and he couldn't help but revel in the moment. He spent about 10 minutes in the alley, happily freaking out before continuing his patrol, which turned out to be quite uneventful for the rest of the night. He stopped a few minor incidents, but nothing significant occurred. By 2:35 a.m., he made his way back to his apartment and fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. The next morning, Izuku woke up at 3:35 a.m., having gotten an hour of sleep, which he deemed sufficient. He got ready to head down to the cafe by 5 a.m. After showering and brushing his teeth, he spent the next hour on his online courses, as he had no other plans for the morning. Natalie had insisted he attend an online class for third-year middle schoolers, which he found incredibly dull. However, he was also enrolled in a more challenging course with very few students due to its difficulty. Unbeknownst to Izuku, this course had been created by a certain individual who had been keeping an eye on the student achieving perfect scores on every assignment. After finishing his work for the day, he headed down to the cafe to begin his shift. Meanwhile, Aizawa had called Tsukachi as soon as he noticed that Nightfall had disappeared. Tsukachi, busy at the scene with police sirens wailing in the background, informed Aizawa that he was on a call with Nightfall and suggested they talk later. Aizawa stated blankly that he had met Nightfall, prompting Tsukachi to express his surprise and say he would be there shortly. 5 minutes later, Tsukachi and his team arrived with an ambulance for the criminals. He found Eraserhead and began questioning him about the vigilante. Aizawa explained that he hadn't learned much but noted that the recorded height and outfit matched the reports. He added that the vigilante seemed quite childish, which was all he had for now. Tsukachi took notes and continued discussing the incident with Aizawa, receiving the report that Nightfall had written before Aizawa was free to go. Once back at the station, Tsukachi placed the new papers into the vigilante's growing folder. Despite the folder being thick with numerous incidents, this was only due to the number of cases they had resolved. With the addition of this report, there were now 3 pieces of paper linked to the vigilante and potential clues to their identity, amidst hundreds of documents detailing the crimes they had thwarted. He was pretty sure that ever since he took on this case, the number of gray hairs he found on his head had multiplied tenfold. He sighed as he fell into his desk chair, yawning while recalling the coffee Aizawa had brought in earlier before his patrol. Aizawa had called it the liquid of the gods, and it was clear he was right. After taking a small sip, he felt as if he had seen stars. This coffee was incredible. He decided he should visit the place himself sometime, just needing to ask Aizawa where it was. He resolved to inquire in the morning, allowing Aizawa some well-deserved rest, but he was determined to find out where this delightful brew came from eventually. He wanted another cup and to compliment whoever made it, not that he would beg to become their disciple and learn their ways. Izuku pulled his work uniform from the cupboard, a white shirt, brown trousers, and a thin black tie. He was all set for work. In the bathroom, he quickly brushed his teeth and attempted to tame his unruly hair with various products, but it stubbornly remained in its natural messy state. Defeated, he returned to his bedroom, slipped on a pair of black socks and his shoes, and submitted his middle school work along with part of the work he had already completed. Once he clicked submit, he made his way down to the cafe to prepare the space for customers. Izuku moved from table to table, placing decor, packets of sugar, extra milk for the coffees and teas, along with napkins and cutlery for those who ordered pastries. He turned on the coffee machine to let it heat up and scrubbed the display case for the baked goods, making room for his upcoming creation. He adjusted the oven's temperature and let it warm up, pondering a very important question: what should he bake? Cookies, cupcakes, croissants, donuts? The possibilities were practically endless. After muttering to himself for 5 minutes, he finally made a decision. He whipped up the mix and placed it in the oven on a tray. About half an hour later, he had freshly baked cinnamon rolls sitting on the cooling rack. Smiling at his creation, he began to make the icing when Natalie walked in, throwing up her hands with an exasperated expression. Izuku could see her exhaustion as she attempted to sound stern. She was definitely not a morning person. He grinned fondly at her, the closest thing to a mother figure he had. She insisted that if he didn't stop coming in early, she would have to put a lock on the door until she arrived. Izuku rolled his eyes as he iced the cinnamon rolls and placed them decoratively in the display case. He kept one in his hand and handed it over to Natalie, hoping this would get her off his case. She glared slightly at him before snatching the baked treat, declaring that she would take it because it was absolutely divine, but he was still not off the hook. After about 10 minutes of back and forth, they reached an agreement. Natalie realized she couldn't prevent Izuku from working early and instead managed to have him accept payment for the extra hours. By then, the time had ticked to around 7. Natalie opened the shop while Izuku went into the back to prepare Aizawa's coffee, starting the brew at around 7. When Aizawa trudged into the shop at 7:25, his coffee was waiting for him on the counter. Natalie had gone into the store cupboard to refill the sugar, and Izuku was still in the back, so Aizawa left the money on the counter before heading to his usual table. It may have seemed strange, but Aizawa thought of Izuku almost like a nephew. They had known each other since Izuku first came to work there last year, and Natalie was almost like a sister to him at times. When Izuku emerged from the back to take a customer's order, Aizawa gestured for him to come over once he was finished. Izuku nodded at the hero and quickly prepared the customer's order, handing it over in exchange for their coins. He then joined Aizawa at his table, asking if he needed something. Aizawa, sounding a bit sleepy, told him to drop the formalities since they had known each other for about a year. He mentioned he had some new information on Nightfall, the Vigilante. Izuku feigned ignorance, showing pure curiosity as Aizawa explained the night's events. When Izuku asked about the kid, Aizawa reassured him that she was living with a kind family found for her in the foster care system. A sigh of relief escaped Izuku. The kid was okay, and that was all that mattered. They chatted for a while longer until another customer arrived, prompting Izuku to return behind the counter to serve them. Soon after, Aizawa took the takeaway coffee Izuku had prepared for him, leaving his money on the counter once again before walking out the door. The bell above signaled his departure. During their earlier chat, Aizawa had asked Izuku if he could have it made early today. He had a staff meeting to attend, and he dreaded it. There was going to be a new hire in a few months when the new first years would begin their exams. Aizawa thought to himself that it was just lovely, more loud people to disturb his sleep, as he sighed and begrudgingly left for work. About an hour later, Izuku informed Natalie that he was going up for the day. She nodded at him and wished him good luck with his test. Izuku smiled as he went up the stairs. Technically, the curriculum stated he should be taking a test right then. However, Izuku had already completed it by hacking into the school files to find the information. He simply pressed submit on the work for both his middle and high school courses. Feeling bored, Izuku began completing future assignments for the high school course, having already finished the middle school one quite a while ago. It was just a matter of handing in the work whenever it was due. Eventually, he grew tired of the schoolwork and opted to focus on his vigilante suit. He took out his mask and fiddled with the inside of it, fixing the voice changer that had been acting up lately. If the mask were to break while he was out, the police might get an inkling of how young he was, bringing them a step closer to catching him, which he wouldn't allow. Izuku then took out his knives to sharpen them and polished the metal soles of his boots, ensuring no damage had occurred during his last patrol. He muttered to himself as he checked everything, smiling widely once he confirmed that his costume was ready. Now the real fun could begin. Izuku pulled out his book of blueprints and a small box of mechanical parts he had been collecting over the last few months. He was working on something that most believed to be impossible, zero-gravity technology. If his blueprints were correct, it should work. He shook with excitement at the idea of a technological breakthrough but had to calm himself before starting, as that could be a bit dangerous. Izuku worked on the project for a couple more hours until it was 4 o'clock, the time he usually went back down to the cafe. He packed his project away under his bed in a small box with a secure lock, placing the parts he was using beside it. His blueprint book went inside the cupboard, as the information in those notebooks was sensitive and groundbreaking. If the wrong person got their hands on them, it could deconstruct hero society, and the technology could be easily exploited. He wasn't worried about Natalie. Rather, he was concerned about anyone who might break in to uncover this information. One could never be too careful. Once he had everything packed away, Izuku climbed down the stairs and opened the door leading to the cafe. He noticed that all the cinnamon rolls had disappeared from the display case, and Natalie was busy serving a customer at the counter. Izuku listened to the customer's order and went to prepare it in the back while Natalie chatted with them, handing over their change. When she turned around, she was surprised to see Izuku holding the customer's coffee with an innocent smile. She clutched her hand to her chest in shock, exclaiming that he almost gave her a heart attack. Izuku smirked as he handed her the coffee, which she then gave to the customer. At 5 o'clock, Natalie took her break, and by 6:30, she was leaving to head home, holding a coffee that Izuku had made for her to take along. She waved enthusiastically at Izuku through the shop window, and he returned a slight wave as she walked down the street. After finishing cleaning the coffee machine, Izuku made his way back up to his apartment, where he immediately put on his vigilante outfit. He felt as if he had been pumped full of adrenaline and thought it best to make use of this sudden burst of energy by saving others. It wouldn't hurt to patrol just a couple of hours earlier, would it? Yes, it would. He soon found out when both Hawks, the number 3 hero, and Eraserhead began chasing after him only 45 minutes into his patrol. Izuku decided he would stick to 8 o'clock in the future as he ran. It sounded strange when put that way, didn't it? Regardless, it was time to explain how these two ended up chasing the vigilante. At the start of Izuku's patrol, after jumping from his window and sliding down onto the fire escape, he climbed his way up the side of an apartment complex, a routine for most teenagers. He had discovered that this was the best place to begin his patrols, with buildings in each direction to jump to, providing him with plenty of options. Today he headed east, having noticed a spike in drag sales in the area. With the information he had gathered from criminals, he knew he would be of use there. The heroes were also aware of the situation. Eraserhead and Hawks were chatting, with Hawks about to finish his patrol in an hour while Eraserhead prepared to start his. They had just bumped into each other, and Hawks was engaged in a one-sided conversation while Aizawa searched for an escape route. Izuku made his way over the rooftops to the prime location for these sales. It seemed a bit foolish that the dealers used the same spot, but it made things easier for him, so he wouldn't complain. Hawks stopped mid-conversation, noticing the approaching figure in his peripheral vision and pointed it out to Aizawa. Izuku was too far away to see that they had noticed him. Hawks took out a high-tech camera and decided to record, zooming in on the figure. Aizawa recognized the costume. It was Nightfall, the vigilante he had met not long ago. The two heroes nodded to each other and took off in the vigilante's direction, moving swiftly while staying low to avoid detection. Izuku soon noticed the two presences below him, recognizing one as Aizawa and assuming the other was another hero. Once he realized they were there, he spun around and ran in the opposite direction as fast as his legs would carry him. The heroes noticed this and began to pick up their pace, Hawks taking to the skies while Aizawa used his scarf to swing after him. Izuku looked back at Aizawa in disbelief, wondering how he was managing to drink his coffee from a flask while chasing the vigilante. Hawks was in shock. He was the number 3 hero, known for his speed, yet here was this tiny vigilante outrunning him on foot with another pro hero hot on his tail. He thought to himself, questioning how this was possible, and decided to send out feathers to catch the vigilante. Izuku dodged the feathers with grace, making it seem effortless, as if a child could do the same without breaking a sweat. The pros were astonished and starting to run out of stamina. Aizawa, breathing, communicated through his earpiece, expressing his confusion about Nightfall's energy levels, while Hawks grunted in agreement. Suddenly, they realized the vigilante had vanished. Aizawa's eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of him until he spotted Nightfall down below in an alleyway. He dove down, but the vigilante narrowly avoided him, climbing back to the rooftops using a drainpipe. He attempted to leap to the next building but misstepped, tumbling down to the ground. Instead of landing hard, he managed to leap into an open dumpster, cushioning his fall. Hawks burst into laughter, and even Aizawa let out a small chuckle before returning to his usual expression as they watched the vigilante thrash around inside, groaning like a child throwing a tantrum. Izuku muttered to himself about the stupid dumpster, while Hawks continued to laugh, and Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose, exasperated. Aizawa greeted the vigilante, who introduced himself as Nightfall and offered his hand to Hawks. As Hawks came down to shake his hand, a farting sound erupted, and Nightfall burst into laughter, revealing a whoopee cushion. Hawks was amused, while Aizawa remained unimpressed. Aizawa, trying to regain control of the situation, told Nightfall he was under arrest for vigilantism and asked him to cooperate. Izuku sighed, responding that he couldn't comply. Aizawa insisted he had no choice, being cornered by two pro-heroes. Despite the situation, Izuku smirked behind his mask and launched himself upwards, bouncing off the opposite wall and into Hawk's face, propelling himself back to the rooftops. Aizawa immediately began to chase him, with Hawks following a few seconds later, feeling the sting of his metal-soled boots. The chase continued over rooftops, and eventually, Izuku yelled out, expressing his frustration about being chased for simply coming out early. He weaved right and left, trying to lose his pursuers, but to no avail. Aizawa called out, asking if he was male, hoping to gather some information even if they couldn't catch him. The vigilante paused, surprising the two professionals who continued to rush toward him. He proclaimed that even with the voice changer, they should be able to tell he was a guy. Aizawa questioned how that was possible, to which the vigilante proudly declared that his spectacularly appealing deep voice was the answer, striking a pose with his hands on his hips. Hawks chimed in, teasing that he sounded like a squeaky door hinge, and no amount of technology could disguise that. Nightfall retorted dramatically, but Aizawa decided to cut the banter short, noting that he had assumed Nightfall was male and extremely annoying. Izuku giggled childishly, the voice changer making it sound like a malfunctioning computer. He then announced that he needed to leave, as he had people to save and tasks to complete, before disappearing from their sight. The two heroes exchanged groans, both aware of the paperwork awaiting them despite not having caught the vigilante. At least they had gathered some information that could narrow down their list of suspects. Aizawa was puzzled. Most assumed Nightfall was a short adult, yet the vigilante acted more like a child. His skills, however, were far beyond what one would expect from someone so young. Aizawa decided to chalk it up to childish behavior for now. After all, it was entirely possible for an adult to act like a child. Just look at Hawks. Meanwhile, Izuku dashed down the alleyways, retracing his steps. He needed time to process the information and devise a plan. He pulled out a file on the clothing company that owned the warehouse he was targeting. While not a major brand, it was well known enough that no one would suspect them of anything illicit. Izuku had noticed an unusual influx of money in the company's accounts and had gathered intel from informants to build his case. Recently, there had been a surge in the marijuana market, leading to an increase in crime as people sought money for their habits. Folding the file back into his belt pouch, Izuku sprinted toward the warehouse. Upon arrival, he spotted two guards outside, which was typical for companies in shady areas. He stealthily climbed onto the roof and swiftly incapacitated the guards with precise strikes. Pulling out a peculiar device, he began to break into the area where his informant had indicated cannabis was being grown. He attached the device to the window, pressed a few buttons, and removed the entire pane without breaking it, placing it carefully on the rooftop before swinging inside. As he suspected, rows of plants were growing inside, ready for sale to the city's attics. Izuku walked through the room, using a small camera to capture several photographs of the plants before jumping back outside to photograph the warehouse. Just then, another guard spotted him and rushed out, knocking Izuku to the ground with a punch, leaving him seemingly unconscious. Lying there, Izuku allowed the microphone in his suit to record the conversation between the guard and a colleague, which contained sensitive information about the company and its crimes. While he had already known much of this from his informants, having evidence was crucial for dealing with the police. Once the guard began to dial for backup, Izuku sprang into action, knocking him out before fleeing into the night. The encounter had taken longer than expected. The call had lasted about half an hour, and the chase with the professionals had consumed who knows how much time. It was nearly time for Izuku's patrol to end. He sighed as he made his way back to the cafe. Once there, He typed up a report detailing the night's events, edited the audio to highlight the important parts, and compiled all the photos onto a memory stick for the police. After wiping it clean of fingerprints, he left it on his desk and flopped face down on his bed, exhausted. He muttered to himself that tomorrow would be the day to deal with everything, surrendering to the wave of tiredness that washed over him. The next morning, Izuku woke up an hour earlier than usual, having barely managed an hour of sleep. Instead of donning his work uniform, he slipped into his vigilante costume, grabbed the drive, and leapt out of the window. Yawning all the way, he sprinted to the local police station to deliver the information. Approaching Detective 𝗧𝗜𝐬𝐽's window, he found the man still half asleep at his desk. Izuku chuckled and tossed the memory stick lightly at the detective's head. 𝗧𝗜𝐽 jolted awake, startled to see his favorite vigilante waving at him through the window. As the detective plugged in the drive and began to read the information, he was about to thank Nightfall when he realized the vigilante was already gone. Only a slip of paper remained taped to the window, reading that Nightfall didn't have time to chat but hoped the detective would get some more sleep that night. 𝗧𝗜𝐽 sighed, muttering that Nightfall would be the death of him someday. Just then, his phone rang, and he answered to find Aizawa on the line, who mentioned that he had encountered Nightfall again the previous night, sounding just as tired as 𝗧𝗜𝐽. Me too, but just a minute ago, they dropped off a drive on a drag company, 𝗧𝗜𝐽 replied. He asked if there was any new information. Aizawa responded that Nightfall was now assumed to be male, and they had managed to gather that much, but it was all they had. Normally, 𝗧𝗜𝐽 would be thrilled to receive any new intel on Nightfall, as they had very little so far. However, he felt too exhausted to react enthusiastically, so he simply noted it down in the ever-growing file and prepared to sort out the drag company. Aizawa accompanied him to the warehouse to assist with the arrests, leaving Natalie to worry about him being attacked by a bear. Izuku reassured Natalie that Aizawa not being there at his usual time did not mean he had encountered a vicious animal or that he was dead. Natalie, however, insisted that it did, exclaiming that Aizawa never missed his coffee for anything, tears streaming down her face. Izuku pinched the bridge of his nose as he comforted her. At 9:55, Aizawa walked in, catching Izuku just before he was about to go off shift. Seeing him, Izuku quickly rushed into the back and prepared a cup of pure caffeine along with a flask of tea, handing them to Aizawa with a small smile. Aizawa thanked him but mentioned he had to leave, as he had already asked Mike to cover his homeroom. He was curious about the tea as he rushed out the door. Izuku chuckled, thinking it might help 𝗧𝗜𝐽 be in a better mood about Aizawa's tardiness, and waved goodbye to the pro who had been chasing him around the city just the night before. Aizawa called out his thanks before sprinting away. After clocking out, Izuku went upstairs to work on some school assignments after submitting his middle school work, which was due that day. He focused primarily on advanced mathematics. Meanwhile, 𝗧𝗜𝐽 sat at his desk, stretching his snow-white paws with a grin, eager to check on his online students. One student in particular had caught his attention, consistently achieving perfect scores since joining the course about a year ago. He scrolled through the list of 50 students, which was relatively small for a high school course, and found that student. They went by the name 𝗬𝗍𝗍, with no last name provided and minimal personal data, preferring to leave most fields as rather not say. There was no quirk, no address, no gender, nothing that indicated who they were. They might have even been using a fake name. As he reviewed the most recent assignment to grade it, he found it incredibly difficult to identify any real mistakes. Intriguing. Very intriguing. He muttered to himself with a sinister grin. He had hacked into their Google account not long ago but had not uncovered anything related to the student's identity. The other accounts were protected by complex security measures that would have taken him days to breach, so he decided to leave that data alone for now. There was likely a reason for such robust protection. From the files he had accessed, he discovered that this student was significantly ahead in the course, submitting work as it was due. This was quite impressive. He had encountered very few humans with such high intellect in his lifetime. He hoped to meet the student at some point, as discussing plans for world domination with someone of their caliber would be a refreshing change. He took a sip of the tea that magically appeared whenever he wished for it and resolved to make it his new mission to find this student. Perhaps he could even challenge them to a game of chess. While submitting their grade, he added a note inviting them to play a game with him, providing his username as @ratgod, and expressing his eagerness to connect. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 then began typing on his computer. Tracing a location was second nature to him given his experience. He attempted to trace 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲's device, initially finding it supposedly based in Antarctica, which was clearly incorrect since the tests could only be accessed by residents of Japan. He tried again, and this time the location appeared to be in Australia. Must be protected too, he muttered to himself. This student was a mystery he was determined to solve. Suddenly, Aizawa burst into his office, apologizing for being late. He explained that he had to assist the detective with an arrest related to Nightfall. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 reassured him that his homeroom had been covered and reminded him to get to his first class, which was starting soon. Aizawa nodded, pulling a flask from his sleeping bag and placing it on 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐴's desk. He mentioned that a coffee shop he frequented had provided the tea for 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐴 since he was going to be late. 𝐒𝐮𝐴's interest was piqued. If Aizawa praised it, it must be good. He opened the flask and took a sip, nearly jumping out of his seat with amazement. It was truly heavenly. 𝐒𝐮𝐴's thoughts were clearly displayed on his face as Aizawa suggested taking him to a place after school. Aizawa sighed and asked if this meant he would drop the blackmail, his voice tinged with hope. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐴 nodded, as it wasn't a significant loss for him. He already had other late arrivals against Aizawa, including the time he accidentally knocked his precious tea to the floor. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 advised Aizawa to get to class and to inform Nomuri of the plan during lunch. Aizawa nodded sleepily and made his way out the door toward his classroom. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 savored the rest of the tea he had been given, finding it truly delightful. After school, the three of them entered the coffee shop together and settled around Aizawa's usual table. Nomuri sat next to Aizawa, while 𝐒𝐮𝐴 took a seat opposite them. The shop was cozy and surprisingly quiet, given the quality of the products served there. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 inquired if Aizawa knew who had made the tea he enjoyed earlier, expressing a longing to compliment the creator. Aizawa responded affirmatively and walked closer to the counter, calling out to 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐴, the student responsible for the tea. 𝐒𝐮𝐴's ears perked up at the mention of 𝐒𝐮𝐴, and a grin spread across his face. He had expected to search for this enigmatic student, but it seemed the task was turning out to be quite easy. Aizawa returned with a purple-haired boy who wore a nervous smile. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 thought to himself that this must be 𝐒𝐮𝐴. Meanwhile, Izuku spotted the three pro heroes entering the shop and immediately ducked behind the counter, feeling a wave of fear wash over him. He reminded himself that he was just a barista and that only vigilantes and villains should be afraid of pro heroes. When Aizawa called out again, Izuku jumped slightly at the loud voice. He approached the group, smiling nervously and waving. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 introduced himself as the principal of UA and gestured to Midnight, who was dressed in civilian attire. Izuku shook 𝐒𝐮𝐴's paw gently and asked what they would like to drink. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 ordered another tea. Aizawa requested his usual special, and Midnight chose a caramel frappuccino. Izuku hurried to the back, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and took a moment to compose himself. He reminded himself that he was 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐴, not Nightfall. Before preparing their drinks, he returned with a tray, placing the cups in front of each person. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 took a sip of his tea and exclaimed in joy, delighted by the fresh taste, while Midnight managed to finish her drink in mere seconds, leaving Izuku both impressed and slightly disturbed. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 called out to 𝐒𝐮𝐴, halting him in his tracks, and asked where he went to school. Izuku hesitated, stumbling over his words as interaction with new people was not his strong suit, especially when they were pro heroes. He stuttered that he took online classes for middle school, and 𝐒𝐮𝐴's internal grin widened at the revelation. The realization that this exceptionally talented student was likely middle school-aged excited him. He pondered the possibility of 𝐒𝐮𝐴 having an intelligence quirk or, even better, being naturally gifted. An awkward silence followed, and Izuku considered excusing himself to return to work. Midnight broke the silence by asking about his quirk, a common topic that made Izuku uneasy. He feared that such questions often led to negative experiences. Aizawa, having meant to ask about it before, perked up at the inquiry. Izuku finally admitted that he was quirkless, looking down as he spoke. Aizawa and Namuri exchanged surprised glances, having never met a quirkless person who wasn't elderly. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, however, wore a grin that could rival the devil's, finding this unexpected development fascinating. Another moment of silence passed, and Izuku decided to excuse himself. He thanked them for the chat, offering a shaky smile before heading back to the kitchen. Midnight expressed concern that she might have upset him, noting that it seemed like a sensitive subject. Aizawa reassured her that Izuni was always like that around new people and likely wasn't bothered by it. He then turned to 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, questioning the reason behind his grin, recalling that the last time he saw it, 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 had caused quite a stir. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 simply stated that he had his eyes on Izuni, finding him to be a very interesting student. Aizawa, surprised, asked if Izuni was taking 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴's course, his disbelief evident. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 smiled at Aizawa's deduction and nodded in affirmation. Aizawa pressed further, curious about why 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 was so interested in Izuni and if he was performing well. Perfect scores on everything thus far, he's even been completing most of the work set in advance, 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 remarked while taking another sip of his tea. Aizawa's jaw dropped as he glanced toward the kitchen door, where the boy was preparing another coffee. Just how intelligent was this kid? Most third years struggled with 𝐒𝐮𝐴's tests, and the online ones were supposed to be even harder. Even the majority of the staff claimed they were nearly impossible. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 then asked Aizawa if he happened to know how old Izuni was. Aizawa, still confused, replied that he believed the boy was 𝐒𝐮𝐴 requested Aizawa to bring the owner over, assuming he would know her. Aizawa was puzzled about why 𝐒𝐮𝐴 wanted to speak with Natalie but had learned not to question the rat god himself. He called Natalie over, and she quickly approached, asking what was up. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 introduced himself, and Natalie responded that she preferred to be called by her first name. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 then inquired about Izuni's true age. Natalie, taken aback since no one had ever questioned Izuku's age before, decided it would be best to tell them the truth rather than fabricate a lie. She explained that Izuni was actually 14 and that most people disapproved of him working at that age, so they used a fake age. Midnight, intrigued, asked why he wanted to work at such a young age. Natalie explained that she was his legal guardian and that he insisted on earning his money instead of simply accepting an allowance. Aizawa was already aware of this from previous discussions. The heroes accepted her explanation. Natalie continued, mentioning that Izuni didn't enjoy much interaction, so he was currently enrolled in an online middle school course. She fondly giggled as they glanced toward Izuni, who was nervously taking someone's order at the counter. Aizawa began to ask if Izuni had not informed them about his course, but 𝐒𝐮𝐴 interrupted him, thanking Natalie for her time and suggesting they let her return to work. Natalie waved goodbye before taking over the counter from Izuku. Aizawa looked at 𝐒𝐮𝐴 in confusion, wondering why he had stopped him from asking about the course. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 seemed to read Aizawa's thoughts, explaining that it wasn't their secret to share. If Izuni wanted Natalie to know about it, he would have told her himself. Aizawa realized his near mistake and nodded at 𝐒𝐮𝐴 before finishing his coffee. The three heroes soon exited, calling out a farewell to the two baristas as they walked through the doors. Izuku sighed in relief as they left, continuing to make coffees for the new customers that arrived. As 6 o'clock approached, Izuku said goodbye to Natalie, locking the door behind her as she walked to her car. Once she was gone, he did a final check of the shop, picking up stray tissues and other items that had been overlooked during the day. After disposing of everything, he made his way up to his apartment. Once again, Izuku decided to spend the 2 hours he had before patrol studying. Old habits were hard to break. Today, he focused on science, specifically biology, a subject that surprisingly came in handy during patrols, especially regarding human anatomy. Understanding the human body allowed him to prepare better for confrontations and to know how to subdue opponents with minimal harm. The 2 hours flew by as Izuku immersed himself in his reading material. Noticing the time, he closed the book and returned it to the cupboard before pulling out his vigilante costume. He donned the outfit and typed into his computer, setting today as the day he would take down a child fighting ring he had been investigating for a while, having just discovered its location a few days prior. The ring was run by a company known as 𝐒𝐼ritten Company in the underground. The name sounded familiar to Izuku, but he couldn't quite place it. As he prepared, he heard a familiar voice in his head, hinting at the company's notorious reputation. Izuku shook it off, recalling that he had experienced nightmares in his youth, perhaps explaining the voice. He dismissed it as coincidence before leaping out of his window to begin his patrol. Glancing down at the device in his hands that pointed him toward his destination, Izuku hopped swiftly from rooftop to rooftop, following its directions. He had a planned mission today, aiming to dismantle a fighting ring that had garnered significant attention recently. It was troubling enough that adults were involved, but this ring primarily consisted of young children who had been picked up off the streets. These kids were easy targets for the company, often discarded due to their perceived weaknesses or lack of quirks. Disgusting, Izuku muttered to himself as he ran. He sensed a faint presence behind him, which made him slightly uneasy, but he chose to ignore it, focusing instead on saving another child from imminent danger. At the ring, Izuku had learned from an informant that young children were being forced to fight against each other for the entertainment of criminal spectators who placed bets. It was not uncommon for these children to be pitted against adults, as those matches generated significant interest. Most fights ended quickly, with only a few months of survival being the best outcome for many. Very few lasted longer, and only one had managed to survive. Past the one-year mark. This situation always filled Izuku with anger. These children had done nothing wrong to deserve such treatment. They were treated like animals, locked in cages and punished for disobedience, an injustice that would outrage anyone if it were inflicted upon a dog, let alone a child. He was grateful for the online information network he had built over the years, which allowed him to gather intelligence on places like this and work to shut them down. A few buildings behind him, Eraserhead was suspended in the air, carried by Hawks, while Present Mic covered the ground below. Eraserhead and Hawks had enlisted Present Mic's help in trying to catch the Vigilante that night, knowing they were unlikely to confront him alone. Present Mic expressed his frustration about their distance from the Vigilante, to which Aizawa explained that getting too close would alert him. Present Mic groaned as they continued to follow the Vigilante, hoping he remained unaware of their presence. Soon, Izuku reached his destination. The exterior of the building appeared to be an ordinary, albeit disheveled, apartment complex, but the inside told a different story, particularly the basement. He leaped down from the building, landing smoothly. The two daylight heroes watched in confusion as he approached what seemed like a regular apartment complex. Hawks questioned whether Izuku lived there, while Aizawa face-bombed, realizing the ignorance of daylight heroes. He explained that many crimes occurred in buildings like this, noting the lack of cars, darkened apartments, and the presence of syringes, all signs of illegal activity. Aizawa concluded that it was likely a fighting ring, drag operation, or something similar. The heroes nodded in understanding and refocused on the Vigilante. Izuku fiddled with a compartment on his belt, retrieving a device designed to remove window panes. He discarded the pane onto the concrete before slipping into the building. The pros edged closer and climbed through the window, following him down the corridor to where the door to the basement awaited. As Izuku opened the door, a cacophony of noise erupted, mostly cheers and supportive chants for a fighter. Aizawa muttered that it was a fighting ring, excitement bubbling within him. The Vigilante had taken down several rings before, but no one had witnessed the action firsthand. They had only seen the aftermath, where bloodied criminals were found to have attacked him first. As Izuku entered the basement, the heroes planned to follow, but their intentions shifted when they heard a high-pitched scream, likely belonging to a child. Aizawa's anger flared as he cursed the perpetrators under his breath and rushed toward the door. They crept down the stairs and peeked into what they assumed was the main room of the basement. A crowd of around 150 thugs filled the space, with a few high-profile criminals scattered among them. Suddenly, a cheer erupted from the crowd, and the heroes turned to witness a horrifying sight. A fully grown man held a child, who appeared no older than 9, in his grasp. The man's arms were encased in a metallic substance, a result of his quirk. The strong smell of iron filled the room as the boy, bloodied and bruised, struggled in the man's grip before being released, collapsing to the floor and desperately attempting to escape. Eraserhead regained his composure first, grabbing his capture weapon and preparing to intervene. However, the Vigilante beat him to it, swinging into the ring from the ceiling. He swiftly grabbed the boy and lifted him onto a platform in the rafters, laying him down gently before turning his attention to the thugs. The pros watched in awe, capturing the entire scene with the cameras embedded in their suits. The vigilante took down criminal after criminal with remarkable ease, making them appear weak compared to the police force and several heroes still pursuing them. Once every thug lay unconscious on the ground, the vigilante climbed back up to the rafters, retrieving a first aid kit from his pocket. He carefully patched up the boy's wounds and provided him with painkillers to ease his suffering while they awaited help. Izuku reassured the frightened child in his arms, telling him he was safe now and that he would call the police to help. The boy clung tightly, expressing his gratitude through sobs and wiping away tears. As Izuku began to dial emergency services, Aizawa took action, throwing his capture weapon toward the vigilante. The vigilante effortlessly dodged the cloth and grinned at Aizawa, who was clearly a threat to the child. Izuku sensed the boy's fear and reassured him that Aizawa was a hero who would protect him until help arrived. The boy hesitated but eventually decided to trust Izuku, allowing the vigilante to lower them both to the ground and hand him over to Aizawa. Aizawa instructed the boy to go to Hawks and Present Mike, who were better with children. The boy complied, and Aizawa then released his capture weapon, wrapping the vigilante and pinning him to the ground. Aizawa's triumphant grin faded as he noticed the vigilante's breathing become laboured, his arms flailing in an attempt to escape. After a few moments, the vigilante suddenly went still, his body limp in the restraints. He whimpered for mercy, and Aizawa felt a conflict within him. Despite his instincts urging him to let the vigilante go, he couldn't afford to do so now. Suddenly, the vigilante managed to free himself and gasped for air, but before Aizawa could ask if he was all right, he vanished from sight. This was not unusual, but it seemed like the vigilante was experiencing a panic attack and was now wandering off alone. The three heroes decided to investigate further and soon found the vigilante picking locks on cages that held malnourished, traumatized children, with a few long-deceased bodies among them. The sight sent shivers down their spines, and they wondered how the vigilante could remain unfazed by such horror as he continued to release the children from their prisons. Emergency services arrived shortly after to check on the children and help them recover physically and mentally before placing them in new families. However, by the time the police arrived, the vigilante had already disappeared, as was his habit. Izuku leaped across rooftops, realizing that the incident had consumed his entire patrol time. Eventually, he made his way home and flopped onto his bed with a deep sigh, too exhausted to do anything else. The next morning, he woke up feeling the effects of adrenaline from the previous night. After completing his morning routine, he headed down to the cafe and prepared one of Aizawa's special drinks, which usually did the trick. Fueled by caffeine, Izuku began baking muffins for the shop. An hour later, he arranged the muffins in the display case for customers. Natalie was running late due to a dentist appointment, so Izuku decided to open the cafe as usual, knowing they rarely had many customers that early. Just after he flipped the open sign, the bell chimed, signaling a new customer. Nizu, the chimera principal of UA, stood in the doorway with a grin, asking if Izuku had time for a chat. Nizu skipped over to an empty table and settled into a cushioned seat. Izuku gestured that he would be right back, and Nizu nodded in response. A couple of minutes later, Izuku returned with a warm teapot and an empty teacup on a decorated saucer. Nizu clapped his hands in delight as Izuku set everything down. Nizu invited Izuku to take a seat and the boy obliged, though hesitantly. As Izuku fiddled with his hands under the table, Nizu took a few sips of his tea before speaking. He asked Izuku about his future plans and life ambitions, his tone cheerful for such an early hour. Izuku replied that he didn't have much in mind, preferring to continue working at the cafe and lead a quiet life. Nizu noted the lack of ambition in Izuku's response but sensed a deeper fire in his eyes, one that burned fiercely beneath the surface. A burning need for something lingered in Nizu's mind, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. He turned to Izuku with his usual mischievous smile and asked if he was planning to try out for UA in the upcoming entrance exam. Nizu noted that Izuku's facial structure was appropriate for his age to apply, and he had already confirmed with Izuku's manager that he could take the exam this year. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 believed it would be a shame for Izuku not to apply, given his remarkable intellect. Izuku hesitated, expressing his doubts about applying to UA. He felt that, being quirkless, he wouldn't stand much of a chance and didn't want to take opportunities away from those with quirks who could be more useful in those fields. A sad smile lingered on his face as he recalled how UA had been his dream as a child, a dream he had buried deep within him. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐴 sighed internally, knowing that quirks weren't everything. He wanted to help Izuku and others understand that relying solely on quirks could be dangerous. Heroes who assumed they could coast by on their abilities often faced dire consequences. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 reassured Izuku that he wouldn't be taking opportunities from anyone. If he scored better on the exam, he would simply be the more suitable candidate. He believed Izuku could fit well in the support course or general education, and perhaps even the hero course if he wished. With Izuku's brilliant mind, it would be a crime not to pursue his potential, and 𝐒𝐮𝐴 felt UA would be the perfect place for him. Izuku sighed, agreeing to consider it but making no promises. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 was pleased with this response and playfully expressed his longing to learn how Izuku made such excellent tea. Izuku chuckled, teasing that a barista never reveals his secrets. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 feigned annoyance, pouting dramatically as he bid farewell to Izuku, who returned the gesture with a smile. Later, Izuku moved to the back of the shop, where Natalie arrived to take over the counter for their early customers. He began preparing another one of the Aizawa specials, ready for their favorite sleep-deprived hero. Just as he finished, Aizawa walked in, looking more exhausted than usual. Izuku guessed it was due to the paperwork from last night's arrest. As Aizawa silently took his coffee and slumped into his usual seat with a groan, Izuku inquired about his well-being. Aizawa muttered about running into a vigilante, expressing his irritation and fatigue. He then pulled a bright yellow sleeping bag from his scarf and curled up inside it, leaving Izuku to wonder if he would ever see that mug again. After a moment, Aizawa emerged from the sleeping bag, still looking incredibly tired. He mentioned that the public had labeled the vigilante as the number one, causing Izuku to freeze in shock. He had known things were going well, but number one. Aizawa noticed Izuku's distraction and commented on it, prompting Izuku to laugh nervously and apologize. Aizawa then explained the previous night's events and the overwhelming amount of paperwork he had to complete. Izuku listened attentively, nodding sympathetically until another customer arrived, prompting him to return to work. After work, Izuku sat at his desk, focusing on his online coursework while still reflecting on his conversation with 𝐒𝐮𝐴. He wondered what 𝐒𝐮𝐴 meant about his intelligence. Although he knew he was a bit smarter than most kids his age, he didn't think he was exceptional. Curiosity led him to take an online IQ test, and he was shocked to discover a score of how had that happened. He had found most of the questions quite simple. Perhaps he was more intelligent than he had given himself credit for, but how did 𝐒𝐮𝐴 know? After all, 𝐒𝐮𝐴 had a knack for understanding things that others couldn't. As the clock struck 8, Izuku donned his black bodysuit, layering a hoodie and baggy tracksuit bottoms over it. It was time for another night of technically illegal but legal activities, and he couldn't help but feel that his days were becoming a bit repetitive. Izuku sat precariously on the edge of a rooftop, swinging his legs playfully in the air. It was an unexpected sight for someone in such a dangerous position, but Izuku was simply bored. With no incidents to resolve that night, he had settled into his perch, scanning the streets for any signs of trouble. His mood was surprisingly bright. The cafe had been quiet earlier, allowing him to avoid the usual crowd and interact only with familiar faces. Natalie, the cafe owner, had even let him leave an hour early, giving him extra time to work on his new blueprints. It had been one of the best days he had experienced in a while. In a narrow alley, he spotted two familiar figures, Eraserhead and 𝐒𝐮𝐴, stealthily moving about, likely searching for crime and perhaps for a certain elusive vigilante. Izuku couldn't help but giggle at their antics. After a few moments of watching them, he decided to approach and greet them. He called out to them, expressing his delight at seeing them again and playfully inquiring about the paperwork from their last encounter. Eraserhead, regaining his composure, shot a glare at Izuku, silently conveying his displeasure with the paperwork. He questioned why a vigilante would willingly approach heroes trying to apprehend them, to which Izuku cheerfully replied that he simply wanted to say hello to his favorite pro-heroes. Eraserhead, with a hint of suspicion, asked what had put Izuku in such a good mood. Izuku, with a playful eye roll, sarcastically asked if new laws had made it illegal for vigilantes to be happy. Eraserhead sighed, observing the childish behavior of the vigilante, who was now playfully interacting with hawks, using feathers as makeshift toys. It was a surreal moment for him, standing next to the number 3 hero and the so-called number 1 vigilante, both acting like children. Aizawa had reluctantly agreed to take on this case with hawks after being frustrated by Izuku's escape 2 days prior. The trio soon moved to the rooftop of a nearby building to avoid any potential danger while they talked. Hawks initiated a conversation, asking Izuku why he had chosen to be a vigilante instead of becoming a hero, given his skills. Izuku paused, contemplating his response before answering in a slightly somber tone. He explained that society wouldn't easily accept someone like him, and while he had once aspired to be a hero, that dream felt out of reach. With a sudden shift in demeanor, he added that he was simply impatient and wanted to help people immediately, his face lighting up with a bright smile. After sharing his thoughts, Izuku announced that he had given them enough for the night. He stretched his arms and legs, called out a cheerful goodbye, and then unexpectedly fell backward off the building. The 2 pro-heroes rushed to the edge, their hearts racing until they saw him hanging from the next building over with a grappling hook. They exchanged relieved glances, silently acknowledging the close call before turning back to find the vigilante had vanished from view. Izuku swung from building to building, grateful that his grappling hook had functioned properly. He had experienced issues during testing, and the thought of falling was always a concern. Suddenly, he paused on a rooftop when he heard a commotion below in an alleyway. Pulling out a small camera, he zoomed in to observe the scene unfolding. He saw a young girl being cornered by 2 others, all around the same age. The girl was covered in a strange plant-like mass. One of the girls, who appeared to be responsible for the plant mass, mocked the victim, while the other stood by, laughing and using her quirk to manipulate the plants, trapping the girl further. The situation was tense, and Izuku knew he had to intervene. The victim cried out for them to please stop, but her plea was met with a harsh blow that sent her head against the wall. Tears mixed with a trickle of blood that fell to the ground, creating a small puddle. Izuku, witnessing the scene, picked up a few stray rocks and flicked them toward the bullies. The first girl exclaimed in surprise as the stones began to rain down on them, some leaving scratches while others caused painful bruises. The 2 bullies exchanged glances before they bolted from the alley, abandoning the girl trapped in the plants they had used to restrain her. Izuku dropped down from his perch on the roof and pulled out a knife, carefully slicing through the vines that held the girl captive. Once she was free, he retrieved his med kit and began to tend to her wounds. The girl stuttered out a question about his identity, and he introduced himself as Nightfall, the vigilante she might have heard about online. He gently inquired about what had happened, and she shared her dream of becoming a hero, only to be told that her quirk wasn't good enough. She expressed her doubts about her ability to save others with her hair manipulation quirk. Izuku shook his head, assuring her that anyone could be a hero, regardless of their quirk. He genuinely believed her ability was impressive and could be useful in many ways. The girl's eyes sparkled with a hint of hope as she listened to him. She revealed her longing to help people and show that those with quirks like hers could also become heroes. Izuku recognized her determination and encouraged her, saying that as long as she trained hard, she would become a great hero. Overwhelmed with gratitude, the girl hugged him tightly, tears of joy in her eyes. Izuku smiled beneath his mask as he finished applying the ointment to her head. He wrapped her face with bandages and quickly wrote a note explaining the situation before gesturing for her to climb onto his back. He offered to take her home, tying his hoodie around her waist for safety during the journey. As they traveled, she guided him with directions, and soon they arrived at her front door. Curious, Izuku asked for her name, wanting to keep an eye on her future in the hero rankings. She introduced herself as 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐽, and he promised to watch out for her. He handed her the note, advising her to give it to her parents and have them file a report with Detective 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽, who could use his quirk to ensure the bullies faced consequences. With that, Izuku shot out his grappling hook and disappeared from her view. The rest of the night was quiet, but Izuku returned to his apartment at 2:37 a.m., having waited for the police to respond to the last incident he had intervened in. He flopped down on his bed, quickly drifting off to sleep. The next morning, Izuku woke up at 4:12 a.m., realizing he had been sleeping too much lately. He felt energized after just 4 hours of sleep and wondered how some people needed even more. After getting out of bed and changing out of his vigilante costume, he began working on his online course, submitting assignments he had completed earlier in the week. As he finished his math work, his thoughts wandered back to a mystery he had been trying to solve: the identity of the anonymous teacher behind the course. No one seemed to know anything about them, and the only evidence of their existence was the graded work returned to students. Intrigued, Izuku attempted to hack into the teacher's accounts but was unsuccessful after many tries. He scoured the internet for information, but found nothing. Frustrated, he muttered to himself about their ability to maintain a low profile before glancing at the time. Realizing he was running late, he hurriedly prepared for the day, pulling on his uniform while brushing his teeth and hair simultaneously. After about 5 minutes, he was ready and headed down to the cafe, only to remember that he hadn't baked anything for Natalie, who would be arriving soon. He didn't want to face her teasing for poor time management. Thinking quickly, he modified his usual muffin recipe to reduce the baking time to about 15 minutes. He gathered flour, butter, sugar, eggs, and chocolate chunks, mixing them together before pouring the batter into cases and placing the tray in the oven at a high temperature. With only a minute to spare, he rushed to clean and sanitize the display case, preparing to showcase the baked goods as soon as they were ready. The timer dinged about 10 minutes later, and Izuku rushed to the oven, quickly removing the hot tray of muffins. There was no time for them to cool; they would have to do so in the display case. Ignoring the heat, he placed the muffins inside and dashed back into the kitchen. In his haste, he dropped the tray and slipped on it, but he quickly picked it up again and placed it in the sink, starting to wash it as if nothing had happened. Natalie entered the cafe around 6:13, finding Izuku washing the tray with a casual demeanor. Unbeknownst to him, Natalie had been watching him through the security cameras on her phone, amused by his frantic movements. She had even seen him fall flat on his face and had been laughing as she approached the cafe, waiting a few moments outside to let him finish before starting her workday. Both of them set up tables, with Izuku leaving halfway through to sterilize the coffee machine and other equipment. By 7 o'clock, they were ready for customers, eagerly anticipating the arrival of their favorite coffee enthusiast at 7. On top of a nearby building, Eraserhead, the sleep-deprived underground hero, observed the streets below for any signs of trouble. He was close to the cafe he frequented every morning, situated in a less desirable area of town, which was often where he patrolled. Another underground hero had an unexpected obligation, leaving him to cover their shift a few hours before his own was set to begin. He desperately needed more coffee. Aizawa watched as Natalie walked to her car, smiling slightly as he heard her call out to Izuku, commenting on his worsening dark circles under his eyes. He chuckled at their exchange before returning to his serious demeanor, focusing on his patrol. Just as he turned his attention to the other side of the city, he heard the sound of glass shattering nearby. Whipping his head around, he spotted a group of 8 robbers, all armed, pointing their weapons at Izuku inside the cafe. He listened intently as one of the criminals demanded money from the register, threatening Izuku. Aizawa readied his capture weapon, preparing to intervene, but paused when he saw Izuku moving toward the group. Aizawa muttered to himself in disbelief, wondering if Izuku was trying to confront them unarmed. Izuku approached the attackers, raising his arms in a gesture of surrender. He had no weapons on him since he wasn't in his vigilante costume, but he felt confident he could handle the situation. He edged closer until he was within range, then leaped over their heads at lightning speed. He struck the first 2 with precise chops, and as the others aimed their guns at him, he took cover behind a table, waiting for the gunfire to cease. Once it did, he sprang into action again, swiftly taking down the remaining robbers until all 8 were incapacitated. Aizawa observed the scene with a stoic expression, though anyone who truly knew him could see the mix of disbelief and admiration on his face. The 14-year-old quirkless boy had just subdued 8 fully grown adults with remarkable ease. Izuku then pulled out his phone, calmly dialing for the police to report the incident and explain what had happened. Afterward, he nonchalantly grabbed a broom and began sweeping up the broken glass from a vase that had fallen during the chaos. Aizawa couldn't help but wonder how Izuku remained so composed after such a harrowing experience. As the police arrived to take the robbers away, they too appeared unsettled by Izuku's calm demeanor. Aizawa pushed the incident to the back of his mind, focusing on his patrol duties. The next day he decided to give Izuku a test. Knowing the boy was intelligent, as evidenced by his perfect scores in 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲's notoriously difficult online course, Aizawa wanted to gauge his abilities in person. He entered the cafe at his usual time, collected his coffee from the counter, left the payment, and settled at his table, pulling out a folder of papers he had prepared the night before. Each of these papers contained a general description of various second-year students, with their faces obscured for security reasons. The real information focused on their quirks and other relevant details, such as diets and exercise routines, as any additional information was highly confidential. Aizawa took a long sip of his coffee before calling out to Izuku, gesturing for him to come over. The cafe was quiet at that time of morning, allowing Natalie to manage the few customers while they spoke. Aizawa invited Izuku to sit across from him and split his pile of papers into 2. He asked if Izuku could assist with analyzing the profiles, which were needed by 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐸 that day. Izuku readily agreed, eager to help his favorite hero avoid 𝐒𝐮𝐸's displeasure. He began to read the first file, and the atmosphere around him shifted. His usual nervousness faded as he muttered to himself, falling into a focused trance. He filled page after page with his analysis, diligently working until he reached the last student. Handing his work to Aizawa with a smile, he expressed his willingness to help with paperwork in the future. Aizawa reviewed Izuku's work and was astonished to find that he had written at least 3 pages on each student. His analysis included drawbacks, potential quirk uses, training improvements, and even assessments of physical prowess based on the provided photos. The depth of information rivaled that of professional quirk analysts. After skimming through the pages to save time, Aizawa took his to-go coffee from the counter, left his payment, and headed to work. 𝐒𝐮𝐸 had called a weekend meeting regarding incoming students, which Aizawa was not particularly thrilled about. Upon arriving at the meeting, Aizawa took a seat beside Present Mike as they awaited the rest of the staff. The meeting commenced shortly after everyone arrived, though midnight was late due to an irresistible craving for a chocolate milkshake. 𝐒𝐮𝐸 began the meeting by discussing the students recommended for the upcoming exams, asking for consensus from the group, which received nods in response. As the meeting progressed, 𝐒𝐮𝐸 inquired if anyone had additional comments regarding the exams. Aizawa surprised everyone by offering a recommendation, which was unexpected given his history of expelling students. 𝐒𝐮𝐸 asked who Aizawa had in mind, and Aizawa suggested Izuku, vouching for his physical abilities and mental capacity. He distributed copies of Izuku's analysis to the staff, showcasing the impressive work he had done. The staff members quickly recognized Izuku's potential. 𝐒𝐮𝐸 mentioned that he had already recommended Izuku for the exams, believing he would be a good fit for UA. He proposed that Izuku should participate in the recommendation exams instead of the regular ones, as he would have a better chance in an obstacle course than against robots. However, Aizawa pointed out that the public might react negatively if a student with Izuku's quirk status took a recommendation spot. 𝐒𝐮𝐸 agreed, noting that it would be best for both Izuku and UA if he applied through the regular exams, although Izuku had expressed uncertainty about applying. Aizawa promised to discuss it with Izuku the next time they met. 𝐒𝐮𝐸 concluded the meeting, instructing everyone to return on Monday before leaving for his office. Hisashi approached Aizawa, who was chatting with Nemuri, and asked about the Izuku kid. Aizawa explained that Izuku worked at the cafe he frequented and had recently single-handedly subdued 8 armed criminals during an attempted robbery. The revelation shocked Hisashi and Nemuri, prompting a flurry of questions that made Aizawa retreat into his sleeping bag, seeking refuge from their curiosity until they allowed him some peace. After leaving UA around 5:45 p.m., Aizawa decided to stop by the cafe to speak with Izuku. He arrived just as they were closing and knocked on the glass door before entering. Natalie greeted him and asked if he needed something. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 replied that he wanted to talk to Izuku for a moment. Natalie informed him that Izuku was rarely busy, lamenting that he spent too much time in his apartment. She went to fetch Izuku from the back. Izuku heard Natalie call out to him from the doorway, announcing that 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 was there to speak with him. A wave of anxiety washed over him as he wondered what 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 wanted. Did he make a mistake in his analysis? Had he discovered Izuku's secret identity as the Vigilante? Or perhaps he simply didn't enjoy the coffee anymore. The thoughts raced through his mind as he found himself moving toward the main area of the cafe, shaking off his trance as he approached 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, who was seated at a table. As Natalie continued tidying up the cafe, 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 asked Izuku if he had considered taking the UA entrance exams. Relief flooded through Izuku. It was just about the exams, nothing as serious as losing interest in coffee. He hesitated, expressing his uncertainty about his chances of getting in. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 thought to himself how humble Izuku was. Despite lacking physical prowess, his intellect could easily secure him a spot in any other course. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 encouraged Izuku, recalling how he had witnessed him handle a robbery situation with remarkable skill, even better than many professional heroes. Izuku's anxiety spiked again at the realization that 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 had seen him in action. Frustration bubbled within him, but he quickly apologized for zoning out, promising 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 he would think about the exams. After 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 left, Izuku hoped he would decide to take the exams, as 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 could use someone with real potential in his class. The following day, Natalie confronted Izuku, insisting he take some time off from work. Izuku protested, explaining that he didn't work long hours and believed he was helping her by being there. Natalie insisted that he was legally required to take time off annually, having let him off the previous year. Izuku reminded her that without him, there would be no drinks or baked goods for the customers. Natalie dramatically clutched her chest, defending her coffee-making skills and recalling her years of running the shop without complaints. Izuku casually mentioned a past incident involving salt in someone's tea, which made Natalie glare at him, insisting they wouldn't discuss it. As they bantered, 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 entered the cafe, looking as tired as ever. He took his coffee from the counter and settled at a table. Natalie seized the opportunity to enlist 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴's help in convincing Izuku to take time off. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, despite his fatigue, echoed her sentiment, emphasizing the importance of taking a break for both mental and physical health. Natalie declared that Izuku would be off for at least a week starting the next day, firmly stating she didn't want to see him in the cafe until then. Izuku rolled his eyes, insisting he would still come by to help, even if it meant he wouldn't be paid. Natalie, undeterred, warned him that if he chose not to take time off, she would be very disappointed in him. She nudged 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, who groggily agreed, adding his own disappointed look. The combined glares from both of them felt overwhelming to Izuku. Finally, he relented, agreeing to take time off but insisting he wouldn't stay away for a whole week. He quickly promised to return by Sunday, trying to shield himself from their intense stares. Natalie laughed victoriously, raising her hand for a high five with 𝐒𝐲𝐴, who sluggishly returned the gesture. She giggled, thanking him for his help. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, wrapped in his sleeping bag and clutching his coffee, grumbled in response, his usual demeanor unchanged. On Tuesday, Izuku began clearing his desk of mechanical parts from his last project. He packed everything into a large plastic storage container, ready to start anew. With his blueprints notebook and several fresh pencils in hand, he felt inspired by a recent villain attack he had seen on the news. The villain, who manipulated different types of energy into various weapons, sparked an idea in Izuku's mind. He aimed to replicate this technology. The next 8 hours flew by as Izuku immersed himself in drawing blueprints and researching parts, neglecting food, drink, and even bathroom breaks. Suddenly, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Natalie called out, reminding him to take care of himself and not to forget to eat and drink. She sighed, knowing how absorbed he could get in his work. Izuku thought to himself that taking care of oneself was overrated, but he eventually made his way to the kitchen, grabbing a few snacks and a glass of water before returning to his desk. He took a couple of bites and a sip before diving back into his work. As patrol time approached, not much had happened, but he found humor in accidentally ensnaring 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 in his capture weapon. He snapped a few pictures on a burner phone and sent them to 𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼, Present Mike, Midnight, and Eraserhead. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 was not pleased when he discovered the photos pinned up in the classroom the following day. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday passed in a blur of tinkering and occasional mishaps with machinery. Thankfully, Izuku's apartment was soundproofed, preventing any alarm from his experiments. He had been trying to get his zero-gravity technology to function for about a month, but each attempt ended in failure. By Friday, however, he finally achieved a small victory. He managed to make a few pens and pencils float for a brief moment. He knew that with continued effort he would eventually achieve a breakthrough. Izuku also decided to start his patrols earlier, which was exhausting for 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼, who had to chase him around for 3 extra hours each day. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 arrived at the cafe each morning looking like a zombie, but Natalie attributed it to withdrawal from not having Izuku's coffee for a few days. On Saturday, Izuku dedicated his daytime to fine-tuning the zero-gravity technology. After 10 hours of work and numerous cups of coffee, he successfully implemented his theories. The last hour before patrol was spent building the tech into a pair of gauntlets for offensive use. The gauntlets could negate gravitational pull for a maximum of 8 seconds on larger objects, while smaller items could float for longer. Izuku tested the gauntlets on himself and found that they could support his weight for about 3 seconds. Though it seemed limited, he knew that repeated activation would allow him to leap through the air as if he were flying. At 5 o'clock, Izuku donned his vigilante gear, climbing around the back of the building to avoid being spotted by cafe customers. He navigated the rooftops to his usual patrol area, where crime rates remained stubbornly high despite his presence. He found himself in an alleyway, calling the police about a recent altercation between 2 individuals. After finishing the call, he leaped back onto the rooftops, using pipes as footholds. Noticing a dark figure on a nearby rooftop and a reddish shape in the sky above, he recognized 𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 and 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 pursuing him once again. Amused by their annoyed expressions, he dropped into an adjacent alleyway. 𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼, determined to catch him, grabbed 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 and flew down into the maze-like alleyways, which had become a tangled network over the years. Izuku had been waiting for a chance to use this to his advantage, leaving miniature cameras hidden around to capture the hero's frantic search for him. Pulling out his makeshift police scanner, he noticed a commotion nearby, ready to respond. Izuku left the maze of alleyways and quickly headed toward the signal he had detected. He stopped on a rooftop overlooking a gang confrontation below. Pulling out his glasses, he focused on the quirks of the gang members, squinting to read the information displayed. As he began to ponder the implications of a quirk that allowed for all-seeing eyes, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his back. Turning around, his glasses identified the assailant's quirk as teleportation. Realizing that the warning had come from the all-seeing eye quirk, Izuku assessed his injury. Fortunately, he believed the shot hadn't hit any vital organs, but he was losing BLD and needed to apply pressure to the wound quickly. Thanks to his high pain tolerance, he was still able to function despite the injury. Meanwhile, 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 and 𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 navigated their way out of the alleyways and onto the same rooftop as Izuku. They noticed a bloodstain where he had been shot and looked down to see Nightfall standing over several unconscious gang members, gripping his side. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 prepared to ambush the unaware vigilante, but 𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 stopped him, pointing out the gunshot wound in Nightfall's back. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 was astonished that the vigilante was still moving despite his injury. As he watched with concern, Nightfall began dialing the police for assistance. Using his grapple gun, he ascended to the adjacent building, prompting 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 and 𝐻𝐼𝐻 to follow. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼 called out to Nightfall, urging him to seek medical attention. The vigilante, speaking through a voice changer, insisted that he couldn't go to the hospital because he would be arrested. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻 argued that getting arrested didn't matter if he was bleeding out. Nightfall remained dismissive, claiming he would be fine. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻, determined to help, grabbed the vigilante's arm and insisted on patching him up, promising not to arrest him in his injured state. Reluctantly, Izuku agreed, recognizing 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻's sincerity and knowing it would save him the trouble of treating the wound himself. 𝐒𝐻𝐼𝐻 applied numbing cream and a small dose of anesthesia, which put Izuku in a relaxed state. making him more susceptible to conversation. Hawks teased Nightfall about his injury, questioning if he was getting rusty. Izuku playfully threw a rock at Hawks, who responded with surprise when he realized Nightfall was only 14 years old. Aizawa and Hawks were taken aback, realizing they had been pursuing a teenager. Izuku quickly excused himself, grabbing his grapple gun and sprinting away, leaving the heroes in shock. Once they regained their composure, Aizawa called Tsukachi to report the situation. The next morning, Izuku returned to work, greeted by Natalie, who was surprised to see him looking even more tired than before. He sheepishly explained that he hadn't been explicitly told to rest. After disappearing into the back, he returned with Aizawa's coffee, prompting Natalie to express her frustration at his lack of self-care. As Izuku opened the shop, Aizawa entered earlier than usual, looking exhausted. Natalie whispered to Izuku that someone missed his coffee, and he chuckled before bringing it over to Aizawa. The underground hero took the coffee and sat at a table, seemingly unfazed by Izuku's teasing about Natalie's coffee. However, Aizawa revealed the shocking news that Nightfall was only 14, the same age as Izuku, and was engaging in vigilantism. Izuku feigned shock as he listened to Aizawa recount the previous night's events, realizing the implications of their discovery. Messing with Shoyuta was one of the most entertaining things in the world, Izuku thought to himself gleefully. 2 weeks had passed since he had finally given in to the persistent nudges from Aizawa, Natalie, and occasionally Nizu. After much encouragement, Izuku had agreed to take the exams. Nizu had been relentless, sending emails and somehow encoding messages into Izuku's laptop. Natalie insisted that experiencing a regular school environment would be beneficial for him, while Aizawa simply echoed the sentiment when prompted. Eventually, the pressure became too much, and Izuku agreed, hoping to appease them all. However, Izuku had no intention of actually attending UA. To him, it meant more time around pro-heroes who were always on the lookout for vigilantes like him, less time for tinkering with gadgets, and the risk of losing precious work hours. He believed it would be a waste for someone like him to occupy a spot at UA when others could make better use of it and potentially become high-ranking heroes. He was not meant to be a hero, he never had been. Though he didn't want to become a UA student, he knew that for many, it was a dream. Therefore, he intended to let those who truly aspired to be heroes take the exams instead of himself. Izuku was aware of his abilities. He could easily pass the exam and get into the hero course. This realization only reinforced his decision not to try. One small mistake could expose his vigilante identity, especially with Eraserhead watching closely while he displayed his skills. He would be caught in no time, and it would be unfair to the other examinees, who lacked his experience. It would be like throwing an adult into a competition with children. Now he stood before UA's massive gates, which were open for incoming students. A couple of pro-heroes were stationed there, keeping watch for any intruders. Among them were Kamui Woods and Midnight, who smiled and gave him a thumbs up for good luck when she spotted him. Izuku returned the gesture with a small wave before entering through the gates. As he approached the main school building, he noticed Aizawa directing students toward their respective exams based on their chosen courses. Izuku thought to himself that Aizawa looked exhausted, as expected. He pulled a flask from his bag and discreetly placed it next to Aizawa's feet, glancing at him before walking past as if nothing had happened. Aizawa picked up the flask, chuckling softly at the note taped to it that read, "Try not to overwork yourself giving directions, 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲." He took a long sip of the coffee inside, determined to do his best. Izuku found his way into the hall for the written exam and took a seat in one of the many rows. Not many examinees had arrived yet, so he waited about 10 minutes for everyone to file in. A boy with wild purple hair sat beside him, looking a bit nervous. Izuku decided to focus on the test. When he had told Nizu about taking the exams, Nizu had warned him not to attempt to sabotage his performance, or he would have to retake it. He only needed to keep his score down in the practical exam, so he planned to have some fun with the written test. Present Mike was in charge of explaining the exams that year. After about 5 minutes of loud instructions about time limits and the importance of not cheating, they were finally allowed to begin. With a loud announcement, Present Mike declared the start of the exam, and the examinees began scribbling on their papers. About 45 minutes later, Izuku had finished the exam, which was supposed to take 2 hours. He realized he had figured out how 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐻 knew about his intellect and was grateful he hadn't tried to flunk the written exam. The questions were simplified versions of those from his online course, a notoriously difficult program with an anonymous teacher. Why hadn't he thought of that sooner? Once he completed the exam, he noticed Present Mike walking toward him. Present Mike leaned in and asked if he had finished. Izuku nodded, and Present Mike confirmed his name as 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐻, handing him a short stack of papers with a message from 𝐒𝐮𝐻 wishing him good luck. Looking through the papers, Izuku found an extra question that required an analysis of his favorite pro hero, which was perfect for him. He spent the remaining time writing page after page of analysis on Eraserhead, complete with images and diagrams. Before long, the exam was over, and Present Mike collected everyone's papers, his eyes widening slightly at the amount of paper Izuku had used, much to Izuku's amusement. Everyone around Izuku seemed stressed about whether they had passed the exam. The boy with purple hair beside him looked like he might be sick. Was it really that bad? Present Mike announced to the group of students that the written portion was over and it was time for the practical exam. He explained that they would demonstrate their skills against robots displayed on the board behind him. Each robot had a corresponding point value, and the goal was to accumulate as many points as possible by either defeating or incapacitating the robots. Before he could continue, one of the examinees interrupted, questioning why only 3 robots were displayed when the pamphlet mentioned 4. He declared that he intended to take the practical exam seriously, unlike some who had spent time doodling during the written portion, casting a quick glare at Izuku. Present Mike responded, clarifying that there was indeed a 4th robot, worth 0 points, which was meant to serve as an obstacle. He advised the students to focus on the robots that would earn them points. Satisfied, the examinee returned to his seat as Present Mike continued explaining the rules. As the examinees filtered out toward their practical exam sites, Izuku focused on how to make his performance believable. He locked eyes with a boy with spiky blonde hair, who seemed oddly familiar. Izuku sensed the blonde was trying to place him too. Feeling uneasy, he hurried away toward his exam site. The blonde started to ask something, but Izuku ignored him and quickened his pace. The blonde let out a frustrated sound. Before heading to his own practical, Izuku stretched in preparation for the exam, having already received approval from 𝐒𝐮𝐻 for his support gear. He knew it would look suspicious if he showed up without any equipment. He wore a jetpack he had made, had a few knives secured to a belt around his waist, and carried a pair of katanas on his back. He also brought a bag full of medical supplies, mostly bandages, knowing that examinees often got hurt during these tests. Additionally, he had a small device in his pocket that he thought might be useful later. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku noticed the examinee from earlier approaching him with a disgusted expression. The boy accused Izuku of trying to mock the academy by bringing weapons, insisting he leave immediately. Izuku stammered that he had permission from the principal to use his gear, but the boy was too intense for him. As he backed away toward the entrance of the practical exam site, Present Mike shouted for the exam to start. Izuku hesitated for a moment before running after the other examinees, needing to make his performance seem convincing. He navigated the area, avoiding most robots until he found a one-pointer. He used his katanas to strike at it, ensuring his movements were less forceful and more deliberate, making it appear as though he was struggling. He repeated this process with other robots, ultimately collecting only 10 combat points. Much of his time was spent patching up and rescuing fellow examinees, many of whom were injured from robot attacks or debris caused by others' quirks. He bandaged around 20 people and saved about 10 from being trapped under rubble. Izuku thought UA needed to rethink these exams if he was the only one keeping the examinees from serious injury. With 5 minutes left in the exam, the ground began to shake, resembling an earthquake. Izuku instinctively sprinted out to see what was happening, realizing how quickly he had moved. He looked up in shock at a colossal robot that had just been unleashed. How were they supposed to avoid that? As other examinees fled, Izuku heard a yelp of pain and turned back to see a girl trapped under rubble, unable to move her leg. His heroic instincts kicked in, and he rushed toward her, knowing that simply pulling the rubble off wouldn't be enough. The robot was too close for them to escape safely. As he ran, he retrieved the device from his pocket and quickly adjusted it for his purpose. Climbing up the robot's leg, he reached its head, which appeared to be the control center. He attached the device to the machine and braced himself for the surge of electricity that followed. The device caused the robot's internal circuits to malfunction, sending a jolt through Izuku's body as it attempted to move. He didn't think he would have to use the base machine he brought in such a manner, especially on such a large and powerful robot. Without wearing any protective gear, he relied on his experience with high voltage from previous encounters. Izuku had felt high voltage many times before, but it was still a shock to have so much coursing through him at once after such a long time. As the robot toppled backward, Izuku fell too, completely stunned and unconscious. Fortunately, the girl trapped under the rubble managed to use her quirk to safely float him to the ground before succumbing to exhaustion. Izuku woke up a few hours later in the UA hospital wing. After a brief conversation with Recovery Girl and a few light taps to his kneecaps for his recklessness, he was allowed to go home. Recovery Girl used her quirk on him, and although he had sustained some burns, they were surprisingly mild, and he felt no residual pain. Despite some suspicion about his quick recovery, they attributed it to Recovery Girl's quirk and moved on. Upon returning to the cafe, Izuku found Aizawa and Natalie waiting for him. Aizawa had already informed Natalie about his reckless stunt, leading to a few playful tugs on his ear and another long lecture about his behavior. Aizawa acknowledged Izuku's efforts, telling him he did a good job, though the smile didn't quite reach his lips. Izuku thought to himself that Aizawa must have meant his act of saving the girl, despite his poor performance in the practical exam. He felt proud of himself for managing to save people, even if he had flunked the test. His thoughts wandered back to the blonde boy he had seen at the entrance, wondering where he might know him from. About a week later, a letter with UA's crest stamped on it awaited Izuku in his mailbox. He hurried back to his apartment and plopped onto his bed, staring at the letter for several minutes before finally tearing it open, eager to see how the principal would inform him of his failure after all his convincing. Inside, he found a letter directly from Nizu, which made more sense than the hologram he had imagined. It stated that he had achieved a perfect score on the written test but only received 10 combat points in the practical exam, which typically meant failure. Confused, Izuku questioned what normally meant as he continued reading. The letter explained the rescue point system, and Izuku's heart raced. This couldn't mean what he thought it did, could it? The letter praised him for providing medical care and reassurance to several of his fellow examinees and for sacrificing himself in the final moments of the exam to save another. These were the true qualities of a hero. The letter concluded by stating that he had earned a total of 157 points and had made it into UA's hero course with the highest score recorded so far. It welcomed him to Hero Academia and expressed excitement about seeing him next month when school started. A playful note followed, advising him to be less obvious in his attempts to flunk exams, as only Aizawa and Nizu had caught on. Izuku dropped the letter in disbelief. He read it over and over, questioning whether he was interpreting it correctly. Thoughts raced through his mind, wondering if they had sent the wrong letter or mixed up his results with someone else's. He had been accepted into UA High School's hero course completely by accident, a phrase that seemed unbelievable. UA was everyone's dream, and one only got in through hard work and determination, except for Izuku, who had somehow managed to pass the exams. A younger version of himself would have been ecstatic about this news, but not this one. Frustrated, Izuku grabbed his pillow and buried his face in it, letting out a long scream. He lamented the fact that the one who passed was someone who had never wanted to be there in the first place. He wondered why some aspiring hero couldn't have taken his place. It felt as if life was conspiring against him. After about 15 minutes, he calmed down. At around 5 o'clock, he called Natalie to share the news before heading to work. He preferred to tell her over the phone rather than risk Aizawa spilling the beans, which would likely lead to a dramatic scene at the cafe. Picking up his rarely used phone, he contacted Natalie, the only person he usually reached out to, aside from an unnamed contact linked to his Vigilante burner phone, which he used to back up images from crime scenes. Izuku clicked on Natalie's contact and then the call button, putting the phone on speaker, which turned out to be a big mistake. She picked up after the first ring, her voice bursting through the speaker with excitement and concern. She exclaimed various questions, her words tumbling over one another. Izuku held the phone away from him, interrupting her panicked rambling to share his news. He informed her that he had been accepted into the UA Hero course starting next month. Anticipating more screams, he moved the phone further away, but instead he was met with a series of incoherent noises. The only words he could discern were Izuku and so proud. He thought to himself that he might have broken her. The last thing he heard before she ended the call was her saying she would be there in 2 minutes. After pulling on his work uniform, he made his way down the stairs to prepare for customers. True to her word, Natalie burst through the cafe doors 2 minutes later, breathing and out of breath. He wondered if she had run all the way there as she dragged herself over to a chair and sat down. She began to congratulate him but quickly rested her head on the table, too exhausted to continue. Sighing at her state, Izuku headed to the back to make her a caramel latte, her favorite, hoping it would wake her up a bit. When he turned back, he found the cup completely drained and Natalie sitting upright, her excitement renewed. She declared how proud she was of him before bursting into tears at the table for the next 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Izuku put a batch of brownies in the oven for later. When he returned, he found Natalie on the phone, shouting excitedly about his acceptance. Unbeknownst to her, Izuku was listening in as Aizawa's dull voice came through the phone, reminding her that he worked at UA and had already discussed Izuku's entrance exam with her. Izuku couldn't help but stifle a laugh as he snuck back into the back room, quickly turning on the coffee machine to appear busy. A few minutes later, Natalie joined him, her face alight with excitement. She announced that they wouldn't be opening the cafe as usual. Instead, they would celebrate, and even Shota had agreed to come along. Though he felt reluctant, Izuku couldn't ruin her joy and decided to stay for the celebration. Before long, the cafe was filled with several regulars, including Aizawa, who had brought along Nemuri and Present Mike. Present Mike was eager to see what Aizawa meant by his godly skills as a barista. Aizawa had to erase his quirk after trying the hot chocolate he ordered, expressing delight as he gulped it down. Nemuri, having already finished her drink in one go, shook her head in amusement. Izuku was grateful that Aizawa kept Present Mike under control, knowing that his quirk could have caused chaos in the cafe. Izuku was engaged in conversation with Ted, an older gentleman who had been a regular for 6 years, ordering the same cup of tea each visit. Ted shared stories from his life, including how he moved from England at 13 and attended UA in the support course. Izuku listened intently, fascinated by every word. Amanda arrived with her daughter, Nancy, a 3-year-old who loved Izuku's baking. Izuku had formed a bond with Nancy, often watching over her while Amanda enjoyed her coffee. Nancy was easily entertained, happily drawing while munching on one of Izuku's baked treats. She even had a small birthday party at the cafe recently, with Izuku baking her cake. After spending time with Ted, Izuku found Nancy playfully bumping into his leg, grinning widely. She took his hand and led him to a table to draw together for the next half hour, which he happily obliged. As he looked around the cafe, he noticed that Natalie was nowhere to be found. The door to the back was wide open, and he couldn't see her inside. Concerned, he took Nancy back to her mother before approaching Aizawa's table. He asked if Aizawa had seen Natalie, noting the slight suspicion in Present Mike's eagerness to have him sit with them. Aizawa sighed at his friend's inability to keep a secret and explained that Natalie had gone out to restock something, possibly sugar. Izuku nodded, thanking Aizawa before agreeing to sit with them. Present Mike reminded him to use his real name in public, as not everyone recognized them in civilian clothes. Izuku quickly apologized, and Yamada reassured him that it was fine. Once he calmed down, he spoke normally, sharing his excitement about starting at UA next month. He mentioned how lucky he felt to have achieved his dream. Aizawa, with a mischievous grin, teased him about why he had tried to flunk the exam, knowing the reaction from the other pros would be entertaining. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and camaraderie, setting the stage for a memorable celebration. This was what he lived for. The two stood in silence for about 2 minutes, their minds processing the unexpected information they had received. Yamada expressed his disbelief, questioning why someone would intentionally try to fail the entrance exams. If he wanted to fail, why even take them? And how had he achieved the highest score without even trying? His jaw dropped comically as Namuri echoed his confusion. Izuku, feeling the pressure, stammered out a defense, suggesting that Shoyudo was just joking. Aizawa, wrapped in his familiar yellow sleeping bag, confirmed he was serious, enjoying the chaos he had stirred. Izuku, feeling overwhelmed, quickly excused himself, claiming he needed to look after Nancy while Amanda took a break. He dashed off to where Amanda was, taking Nancy off her hands to make his excuse more believable. Meanwhile, the pro-heroes at their table bombarded Aizawa with questions about the boy, regretting his decision to bring it up. At another table, Izuku and Nancy played with the fairy dolls she had brought. Just then, Natalie entered, carrying a 3-tier cake iced in pastel green with lilac swirls, the words, "Congratulations 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲," written on top. Later that night, after a long day filled with cake and a few mishaps during his vigilante work, Izuku felt utterly exhausted. The fatigue stemmed more from the earlier social interactions than from his nighttime escapades. He closed his eyes and drifted into a surprisingly peaceful sleep. A month later, Izuku stood once again in front of the UA entrance gates, an agonized expression on his face. He was about to face something he had been avoiding for most of his life: socializing. The month had flown by since he received his acceptance letter, and now he wore the full uniform, a plain black backpack slung over his shoulder. He fidgeted with his tie, uncomfortable since he had never worn one before. After several attempts, he had managed to tie it somewhat decently, though it still looked a bit messy. With a dramatic sigh, Izuku stepped through the open gates, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. His brief time at school after being diagnosed as Quirkless had taught him to keep to himself to avoid trouble. He hunched his back and averted his eyes from those around him, making his way to his classroom unnoticed. He silently thanked his skills as a vigilante for allowing him to approach Class 1A without drawing attention. As he reached the classroom door, he noted its impressive height, wondering if it was truly necessary. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and entered. Inside, only 3 students were present, as he had arrived early to minimize interactions. Most students had opted to wait outside, socializing instead of sitting in the classroom. Among the students was a loud examinee, a quiet boy with bicolored hair, and a spiky blonde-haired boy he recognized from before. The blonde's crimson eyes widened slightly in recognition when they met Izuku's gaze, but he quickly looked away, focusing on his desk. Izuku noticed a slight shake of the boy's head, wondering if he too recognized him, which could lead to complications. Bakugo felt Izuku's gaze on him and, keeping his eyes on his desk, remarked flatly that Izuku resembled someone he used to know. He felt a pang of guilt about moving away, and the last thing he wanted was to be reminded of someone who looked so much like him. After Bakugo's comment, Izuku glanced at the seating chart on the board, found his desk, and settled into his chair, waiting for his classmates. He noted the boy's name was Bakugo Katsuki, a name that seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. How strange it was. Little by little, students began to trickle in, taking their assigned seats and engaging in conversation. They were already forming their friendship circles, which left Izuku dumbstruck as he watched them interact so easily. He wished they could teach him their ways until a loud examinee marched over, interrupting his peace. The boy expressed his admiration for Izuku's performance during the examination, noting how he seemed to grasp the true nature of the exams and the secret scoring system. Izuku, however, quickly corrected him, explaining that he had no knowledge of the scoring system. He simply acted to save those in need. As the room filled with students, a girl with short, chestnut-colored hair rushed in, approaching Izuku and the boy who had been speaking to him. She cheerfully thanked Izuku for saving her during the entrance exams. Flustered, he stammered a response, feeling overwhelmed. Interacting with peers his age was more challenging for him than with adults or young children. Suddenly, Izuku's attention was drawn to the door as he sensed someone familiar concealing their presence. This instinctive reaction usually indicated either a villain approaching or a hero trying to catch him off guard. He sighed, realizing he had drawn the short straw. Aizawa raised an eyebrow as he noticed Izuku looking directly at him, despite his concealed presence. The boy gave a small wave before shifting his gaze to avoid drawing attention to the unusual sight of a human caterpillar wiggling across the floor. After a brief pause, 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 attempted to quiet the chatty class, bluntly stating that if they were only there to make friends, they could leave. The class fell silent, turning to observe the yellow caterpillar on the classroom floor. Upon closer inspection, they realized there was indeed a man inside the cocoon, enjoying a jelly pack while relishing the confusion on the students' faces. Izuku let out a small chuckle, sharing in the amusement. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 reluctantly emerged from his cozy sleeping bag and stood at the front of the room, introducing himself as their homeroom teacher. Izuku thought to himself that he was in for a challenging year. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 rummaged through his sleeping bag, retrieving a flask of coffee and taking a long sip. He instructed the class to head to the gym locker rooms and change into their gym uniforms, which would be in their assigned lockers. He emphasized the importance of not keeping him waiting before leaving for the gym building. Knowing better than to delay 𝐒𝐮𝐴, Izuku sprinted toward the gym, eager to change quickly. Unfortunately, he wasn't fast enough, as students began to pour in while he was halfway into his gym uniform. He did his best to hide his scars, relieved that most students were too preoccupied with conversation to notice. However, a few did catch sight of some of his scars, earning him curious glances but no direct comments as he finished dressing and made his way to the field. Todoroki was the only one who seemed to notice the scars, particularly those on Izuku's back, and he observed that Izuku wore the long-sleeved uniform even in summer. He made a mental note of it before focusing on changing himself. Izuku was the first to reach the field, followed closely by Todoroki, Bakugo, and the rest of the class in a large group. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 noted that it took nearly 10 minutes for most students to change and warned them to speed it up, stating they should be ready in less than 5 minutes unless they had difficulties due to their quirks. The class nodded quickly, intimidated by 𝐒𝐮𝐴's presence as he activated his quirk, causing his hair to float and his eyes to glow red. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 informed the class that they would be participating in a quirk apprehension test. Many students began to complain about missing orientation, but 𝐒𝐮𝐴 dismissed their concerns, explaining that UA was known for its free teaching style and that they didn't have time for ceremonies. He detailed the tests and how they could use their quirks, leaving most students, except for Izuku, Todoroki, and a few others, excited. One student commented that it could be quite fun, prompting 𝐒𝐮𝐴 to pause mid-explanation. He then added a twist: the student who placed last would be expelled immediately and would have to find another school. The class erupted in protests, but Izuku quietly reminded them that 𝐒𝐮𝐴 had expelled his entire class the previous year, silencing their objections. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 decided not to question where the boy had gathered that information. There were simply some aspects of him that would remain a mystery. He instructed everyone to form a line so they could begin the quirk assessment. The students quickly organized themselves, tension palpable in the air. None of them wanted to risk expulsion, especially since they had barely started their journey at UA. They all aspired to be heroes. Some showed their anxiety through nervous expressions, while others kept their feelings hidden. Among them was a purple-haired boy who looked exhausted, and another with split-colored hair who had caught 𝐒𝐮𝐴's attention earlier. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 broke the silence by addressing Bakugo, asking about his furthest throw with the softball in middle school. After a moment of thought, Bakugo replied that it was around 67 meters, his tone dripping with confidence. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 instructed him to try again using his quirk, reminding him to stay within the designated area. Bakugo launched the ball into the air, catching it before pulling his arm back and sending it soaring forward with an explosive burst from his palm. Izuku watched in awe, recalling a voice from his childhood that praised Bakugo's talent. He knew there was a connection between them, but he needed to figure out how to keep Bakugo from uncovering it first. The ball landed far beyond the expectations, traveling over 700 meters. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 presented the results to the class, emphasizing the importance of testing their maximum capabilities to assess their potential for growth. He warned that the student in last place would face immediate expulsion, igniting a sense of determination among the students. No one wanted to be the one sent home, except for Izuku. A wild thought crossed his mind. If 𝐒𝐮𝐴 expelled him, he would be free from the pressures of UA and the complications that came with it. However, Izuku struggled during the tests, failing the ball throw, the 50-meter dash, and the grip strength test. He barely managed to throw the ball, walked through the dash, and hardly registered on the grip strength machine. Tenya Ida watched from a distance, frustration boiling within him as he questioned Izuku's intentions. He couldn't understand why Izuku was not using his quirk, deeming it disgraceful. Aizawa noticed Ida's reaction and turned his attention to Izuku, who approached the seated toe touch with a grin. Aizawa called out to him, instructing him to retake all the tests and actually try this time, or he would inform Natalie of Izuku's lack of effort. The thought of disappointing Natalie spurred Izuku into action. He quickly retook the grip strength test, managing to achieve just above average, ran the 50 meters at a decent pace, and threw the softball around 124 meters. His performance was sufficient to place him in the middle of the class rankings, which pleased Aizawa, who believed Izuku had done well without using a quirk. Little did Aizawa know that Izuku had held back significantly. Once the test concluded, Aizawa explained the situation to Hagakure, who had been on the verge of expulsion. The students then made their way back to the changing rooms. Izuku lingered a bit longer to allow everyone else to leave first, entering the classroom slightly after the others. Fortunately, the teacher had not yet arrived, so he settled into his seat and began jotting down observations from the assessment. Tenya Ida approached him, expressing his outrage at what he perceived as Izuku's failure to uphold Yue's reputation. He criticized Izuku for not using his quirk and for his lack of punctuality, questioning whether Izuku took the school seriously. After enduring Ida's tirade, Izuku finally managed to interject that he did not have a quirk, returning to his notes. He was anxious to finish before English class began with present mic, preparing himself for a possible retort. However, it never came. Ida apologized for his earlier rudeness, introducing himself as Tenya Ida from Semi-Private Academy and expressing a longing to be friends. Izuku filled in the pause with his name, and Ida confirmed it, acknowledging him as Izuni. He found it strange that the boy hadn't mentioned a family name but chose to ignore it. Many people preferred to go by their first names, after all. At lunchtime, Izuku walked into the spacious dining hall, which seemed remarkably large but was obviously necessary given the number of students it catered to. After purchasing his food, he looked around for an empty table but found none. The only table with mostly free seats was the one where Shoto Todoroki sat alone. Izuku recalled that Todoroki had placed second in the quirk test as he approached the table. He hesitantly asked if he could sit there, explaining that the other tables were mostly full. Todoroki simply responded with a nod before returning his attention to his soba. The two sat mostly in silence, both focusing more on their meals than on each other. This comfortable quiet was a relief for Izuku, who often found social interactions challenging. Unfortunately, their peace was soon interrupted by a cheerful voice. Izuku turned to see Uraraka Ochako approaching their table. She greeted him and asked for his family name, to which he replied that he preferred to be called by his first name, Izuku. She then turned her attention to Todoroki, confirming his identity. As lunch continued, Ida and a girl who resembled a frog joined them. They engaged in some awkward small talk, while Todoroki remained mostly silent, his attention uncertain. Eventually, Azui asked Izuku about his quirk, noting that he hadn't showcased it during the quirk assessment. Ida looked ready to answer for him, but Izuku decided to speak up, revealing that he was actually quirkless. The reaction was immediate and intense. Their mouths dropped open in surprise. Uraraka exclaimed in disbelief, while Azui appeared shocked but quieter. Izuku, confused by their astonishment, confirmed his lack of a quirk. Uraraka took a moment to gather herself before expressing her admiration, amazed that he had achieved such scores without a quirk, even in the softball throw. She continued to rave about how impressive he was, while Izuku sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to process their reactions. He pinched himself on the arm to confirm he wasn't dreaming. The students at UA were indeed different from anyone he had met before. Todoroki listened intently, feeling a sense of intrigue toward Izuku. He had achieved a throw of around 114 meters himself, having been trained for much of his life. Perhaps he would consider befriending Izuku. A few days later, Class 1A received their hero costumes from the support department, contained in high-tech cases and ready for their training exercise. The students buzzed with excitement, knowing this would be their first lesson with All Might, the #1 hero. They speculated about what kind of teacher he would be. Some thought he might be terrible since he had never taught before, while others believed he would excel as a teacher due to his status. Their discussions were abruptly cut short when All Might burst through the large door, announcing his arrival with his signature smile. The class fell silent for a moment before erupting into a loud cacophony of noise. Izuku felt a surge of excitement but managed to keep his enthusiasm internal. He noticed the panic in All Might's eyes at the rowdy class, clearly indicating his inexperience in managing a classroom. All Might cleared his throat, attempting to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the chatter. Feeling sympathetic, Izuku approached Iida and whispered in his ear. Iida, who had been busy lecturing Bakugo about his uniform, quickly stood up and called for silence, reminding everyone to respect their teacher. Surprisingly, his authoritative tone proved effective, and the class quieted down, all eyes now on All Might, eagerly awaiting his words. All Might welcomed them to their first heroics class, declaring it the most important class at UA High School. He instructed everyone to grab their costumes and head down to Training Ground Beta once they had changed, emphasizing the importance of looking good as a hero. As he left the classroom, Izuku sighed quietly, reflecting on All Might's approach. He thought a brief introduction would have been appreciated, and he questioned the bias in declaring heroics as the most important subject, wondering about the significance of the other courses. Was Nizu losing his mind? Perhaps he was just trying to entertain himself. The class stood up and moved to grab their new gear from the trolley that had been delivered before their arrival. Uraraka expressed her excitement as she picked up her case, and Izuku echoed her sentiment. Iida joined in with his usual enthusiasm, while Todoroki simply nodded. The group made their way to the changing rooms, and Izuku announced that he would head up ahead, planning to meet them at Ground Beta. He rushed off to change, leaving his classmates slightly puzzled. Todoroki had an inkling about Izuku's reasons for wanting to change first, having caught glimpses of scars before, but he sensed there was more to it. Izuku entered the changing room, opening the oversized door and retrieving his costume. It was a simple black one-piece suit with a hidden zip down the middle, enhanced by the support department's extra decorations. He had equipped himself with various holsters for his weapons, a pouch for medical supplies, and a grappling hook similar to his homemade one. His costume resembled the one he used for vigilante work, minus the baggy clothing. After quickly putting it on, he admired its sleekness in the mirror. The professional materials used in his costume were far superior to what he could obtain, and he wondered if he could lose his costume to get a new one made. His thoughts were interrupted as his classmates approached the changing rooms. Thanks to his ability to conceal his presence, Izuku slipped out unnoticed and made his way to Ground Beta to wait for his teacher and classmates. It didn't take long for his classmates to emerge, excited to showcase their new costumes. Most wore bright, flashy outfits, with only two others, besides Izuku, dressed in darker attire. One was a boy with a bird head, and the other was a purple-haired boy who looked perpetually tired. Hitoshi Shinso surveyed the colorful costumes, rolling his eyes until he spotted another in dark clothing. Their eyes met for a moment, and Shinso, momentarily stumped, decided to shield his eyes from the brightness, earning a slight chuckle from the other boy. He might have approached him to strike up a conversation had their teacher not arrived just then, which was significant since he had yet to speak to anyone in class. All Might greeted the students with a hint of monotone in his voice, explaining that they would be participating in a villain training exercise. They would draw lots to decide partners, and each pair would be assigned roles as either heroes or villains. The villains would guard a weapon while the heroes attempted to capture them or secure the weapon before time ran out. Izuku wondered if Nizu truly knew what he was doing as he stepped up to draw his lot. He was paired with Uraraka, which pleased him. He preferred being with a friend over someone unfamiliar. He pondered the consequences of failing the exercise but reassured himself that it would likely result in a reprimand rather than expulsion. He didn't want to drag Uraraka down, especially since she had the potential to be a great hero. All Might began drawing teams from a hat, determining who would face whom and their respective roles. Izuku and Uraraka were chosen as heroes, set to face Bakugo and Ida. Uraraka mentally prepared herself for the inevitable shouting that would come from Bakugo's participation. Izuku asked her if she could enter the building alone, to which she readily agreed, curious about his plan. He explained that he would search for the weapon differently, and they would communicate via earpiece. She nodded, acknowledging his warning about Bakugo's aggressive nature. As the matches progressed, Izuku focused on checking his equipment and refining his strategy while Uraraka worked to calm her nerves. She trusted Izuku but felt anxious about what lay ahead. When the 10 minutes were up, All Might announced that the heroes could enter the building. Uraraka dashed inside, while Izuku prepared his grappling gun, feeling the anticipation build as he embraced his Nightfall persona. He finally got his grappling gun ready, which took a little while since it was different from what he was used to. Aiming for the topmost part of the building, Izuku shot the grappling gun out, hooking it around a pillar on the roof with practiced ease. He began to climb upwards, checking the windows as he passed them. He seemed calm about this, almost as if he did it every day. Soon, he found the window he had been searching for. Inside was the weapon and Ida, who appeared to be monologuing to himself, trying to get into character. Izuku used this distraction as an opportunity, pulling out another familiar device he had given the blueprints for to the support department and sticking it on the window. The device popped out the window pane for him, and Izuku took it inside, placing it down gently to avoid breaking it and alerting Ida to his presence. Izuku then turned on the microphone on his earpiece and informed Uraraka in a hushed voice that he had found the weapon on the top floor, in the second room on the right. She responded that she thought she had found Bakugo, as she could hear his footsteps, and then she turned off her microphone. Izuku whispered for her to be careful before muting his own. He hoped Bakugo wouldn't injure her, at least not too badly. Returning to the mission, Izuku jumped in and touched the weapon, which was a straightforward action that confused his classmates in the viewing area. All Might announced that the hero team had won. Ida looked around, confused for a moment, before noticing Izuku. He quickly deduced what had happened from the discarded window pane on the ground and commended Izuku for his well-thought-out strategy and stealthy approach. Izuku stuttered his thanks, reverting to his usual nervous self. No one had ever been happy about him beating them. It never ended well for him as a child. He recalled a time in school after being diagnosed as quirkless when he had scored higher than another student. Back then, it had been a good thing, but after they learned he was quirkless, it led to trouble. He had ended up stuck in the janitor's closet at the end of the day, with patches of star-shaped burn marks on his arms from that boy's quirk. He wondered what had happened to him as he, Ida, and Uraraka met up in front of the building and walked together to the viewing room. The whole class was a loud mess of chatter, mostly about Izuku and their confusion over his unflashy victory and lack of quirk display. Shinso, one of the few students impressed by Izuku's skill with the grappling hook, wondered what Izuku's quirk was, since he hadn't used it during the exercise. The group arrived in the viewing room shortly after, with Bakugo having returned about a minute before them. All Might then asked for feedback on the exercise and for the class to name an MVP. The majority agreed that Izuku deserved the title, though many still didn't understand how he had won. A boy with spiky red hair commented that while Izuku had completed the exercise quickly, avoiding confrontation with the villains wasn't very manly. Yaoyorozu explained to the class that confronting the villains wasn't the only objective, securing the weapon was crucial too. She praised Izuku for completing the task without causing property damage or harm to anyone, emphasizing that his innovative method of securing the perimeter was unexpected. All Might seemed flustered by her long response, unsure of what to add. He acknowledged her points but suggested that Izuku could have worked better with his partner. Then he moved on to the next battle, sending 2 more groups to prepare. Bakugo managed to keep most of his rage internal this time, feeling humiliated by being beaten without Izuku even using his quirk. He couldn't shake the feeling of annoyance, especially since Izuku's name sounded similar to his. He attempted to picture the boy with green hair instead of purple, imagining bright green eyes in place of red. It was uncanny how much they resembled each other. Perhaps it was a reminder of how he had treated Izuku in the past. Todoroki was also impressed by Izuku once again. It seemed no one else was skilled with a grappling hook, which was to be expected. He recognized that Izuku had climbed the building with ease, a skill that could only come from constant practice. Todoroki recalled his own experiences with a grappling hook during his father's training, which had been challenging. He doubted Izuku had access to a private building for practice or even a license to use such devices, as they were considered hero support gear. Only hero schools and certified facilities could provide access to them for those over 18. Izuku's nonchalant use of the grappling gun suggested he was no amateur, leaving Todoroki curious about how he had acquired such skills. 8 o'clock had finally arrived on Saturday, and Izuku wished it could have come sooner. He was more than ready to return to his vigilante work. He had been neglecting his duties as the resident vigilante for the past few days. Due to starting at UA, and he had plenty of energy to spare. He didn't plan on sleeping at all that night. Despite enjoying the playful banter with his two favorite heroes, Izuku had the courtesy to inform them about his temporary absence to avoid any frantic searches for him. He had told them he wouldn't be out for a few days due to personal reasons, especially after the incident where he had been injured. They likely assumed he needed time to heal, not realizing he was attending a prestigious hero school he had mixed feelings about. After donning his vigilante suit, Izuku relished the familiar sensation of his homemade protective fabric before leaping out of his apartment window. He began his usual patrol route for the first time in what felt like ages. It didn't take long for him to spot Eraserhead and 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐸 conversing in an alleyway, waiting for the police to arrive, with a couple of restrained criminals lying at their feet. Engrossed in their conversation with the officers on the phone, neither noticed that one of the criminals had managed to free himself and was armed. As the man sprang up, aiming his weapon directly at 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐸, Izuku, who had been watching the scene unfold, knew he couldn't let his acquaintance fall victim to this threat. He quickly retrieved a firearm he had taken from a burglar not long ago and aimed, shooting at the weapon in the man's hand, causing it to clatter to the ground. The two heroes turned at the sound, finally spotting the criminal standing a few meters behind them. Eraserhead muttered to himself, recognizing the situation, while swiftly incapacitating the attacker. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐸, hearing this, looked around with an excited grin, eager to find the young vigilante. Izuku chuckled at the sight before making his way down to greet them. He climbed down a drain pipe and jumped the last few feet, arms outstretched in a dramatic pose. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐸 turned, eyes widening with joy upon seeing Izuku. He rushed over, and the two embraced tightly for a moment. Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose, bemused by their reunion. After all, Izuku had only been gone a few days, not years. Once they separated, Aizawa commented on Izuku's return, expressing his hope that he had finally given up. Izuku laughed, assuring him he wouldn't be so easily dismissed. Aizawa groaned and pulled out his familiar flask, the contents a mystery to everyone but him. The night continued as the trio patrolled, catching villains while Aizawa attempted and often failed to capture Izuku along the way. Izuku had sustained another injury during their escapades but was determined to hide it from Aizawa, not wanting to worry him. They found themselves sitting atop a tall building, chatting while Aizawa still tried to catch Izuku with his weapon. Izuku ducked and leaned out of the way whenever necessary. He asked Aizawa about his new class at UA, to which Aizawa responded with a sigh, confirming he indeed had a new class. Curious, Izuku inquired about Aizawa's experience as a teacher, eager to know who his favorite student was. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐸 chimed in excitedly, but Aizawa quickly cut him off, stating he didn't have the energy to deal with their questions. Undeterred, Izuku playfully pressed for Aizawa's favorite student, half expecting no answer. To his surprise, Aizawa muttered that his own child was in the class. Izuku's eyes widened in shock, and Aizawa clarified that he had adopted the child, as he and his partner couldn't have kids. Izuku had always known about Aizawa and present mixed relationship but never imagined Aizawa would have a child. He reflected on his classmates, trying to determine who it could be, and quickly realized it made sense. Aizawa continued, mentioning his plans to train his child and another student named Izuni to use a capture weapon like his own, if they agreed. Izuku felt a rush of excitement. He could learn to use Aizawa's capture weapon. He had admired Aizawa's skill and weapon for as long as he could remember, and the prospect of training under him filled him with determination. Now he was going to learn how to use it. Before either of the other two could respond, Izuku's device beeped, alerting him to a nearby commotion. Without waiting for the others, he flew off across the rooftops toward the marked area. Hawks and Eraserhead followed a few seconds later, realizing that the vigilante who had been in front of them had suddenly vanished. They soon arrived at the scene, where an apartment complex was ablaze, and the fire brigade had yet to arrive. The two heroes were prepared to let the fire department handle the situation and assist the civilians outside the burning building, which was what they were trained to do. However, Izuku had other plans. He peered through the window of one of the flaming apartments and immediately leaped through the nearest open window into the inferno. The two pros stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Aizawa thought to himself that he knew Nightfall was reckless, but this was pushing it to the edge. As they approached the building, they saw why Izuku had rushed in so recklessly. He was holding a pair of young boys, one around 7 and the other about 5, his form nearly collapsing under the weight. Without hesitation, Aizawa swung into the building, scooped up Izuku and the children, and carried them all back outside. By the time they emerged, the fire department had finally arrived, allowing Aizawa to leave the kids with the firefighters and attend to Izuku. He was covered in severe burns, primarily on his back and arms, and he struggled to breathe, having inhaled a significant amount of smoke. Despite the pain he must have been in, Izuku remained conscious. Aizawa stated that they were going to the hospital while pulling out his phone to call for an ambulance. Izuku, however, weakly protested against going to the hospital, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Aizawa sighed, recognizing the stubbornness in Izuku's eyes. He knew that if forced, Izuku would find a way to escape, but he couldn't let him go, as that would only make things worse. Aizawa reluctantly acknowledged that there was no choice left. Izuku regained consciousness to find himself in a comfortable bed in an unfamiliar room. As he sat up, his mind struggled to piece together the situation. Eventually, memories of the incident flooded back, and he slapped his forehead in frustration for his carelessness. He had gotten hurt and burdened the two pros who should have been focused on their duties. At least he had managed to save those kids. He pulled himself out of bed, his body heavy and tired as he stumbled toward the door, wincing with every step as his burns rubbed against his costume, which he was grateful to still be wearing. While looking around to figure out where he was, a sudden noise from downstairs caught his attention. It was unmistakable. He was at Aizawa's house. The screeching voice of Present Mike was abruptly silenced by Aizawa's quirk. Izuku then checked the time on his burner phone, 5:28 a.m. He had been out for almost 4 hours, and his shift at the cafe would start in about half an hour. Quickly, Izuku searched the room, rifling through various items until he found a pen and paper. He hastily wrote a note of thanks to the pros for their help and an apology for leaving without informing them, explaining that he had other commitments. After making the bed, he placed the note on the pillow and approached the window, only to find it locked. Naturally, they would secure the windows and doors with Japan's #1 vigilante inside. However, the pros had not accounted for his gadgets. Izuku removed the window pane and leaped outside, carefully replacing it afterward. Glancing at the time, he noted it was now 5. He needed to hurry back. Fortunately, he made it just in time, jumping through the window at 5:56, not late but with barely enough time to prepare before Natalie arrived. He dashed upstairs to change into his uniform, knowing Natalie would be arriving shortly. As he began baking, he anticipated her teasing about waking up late and how he was finally getting some rest, but he preferred to have something ready for their customers. Meanwhile, Natalie had been monitoring the surveillance cameras, confused as she watched Izuku burst into the shop through a window in dark, slightly torn clothes and a face mask. Initially thinking he was a burglar, she quickly realized it was just Izuku when he came down from his apartment in his uniform. "What is that boy doing?" Natalie muttered to herself as she unbuckled her seatbelt and walked from her car to the shop. When she arrived, she found Izuku baking brownies as if nothing had happened. Curiosity piqued, she wondered if he had a secret lover, but quickly dismissed the idea, noting that he looked almost homeless and unlikely to meet someone in such a state. Various possibilities swirled in her mind, but she found no conclusion. Deciding to let it go for now, she figured she would find out eventually. If it was something important, Izuku would tell her. At 7:20, as usual, the sign was flipped to open, and the cafe was ready for business, awaiting their resident early riser at 7:25 on the day. Izuku finished preparing coffee for his favorite hero, sticking to the usual recipe of coffee grounds and hot water. He often wondered if this was truly beneficial for 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, given the lack of nutritional value. With a sigh, he placed the coffee on the counter, ready for 𝐒𝐮𝐴 to collect it when he arrived in about a minute. As Izuku returned to the back to clean up some spills, he noticed that 𝐒𝐮𝐴 had already taken his seat at the table, looking visibly agitated as he drank his coffee. Concerned, Izuku approached 𝐒𝐮𝐴 and sat down opposite him. He noticed 𝐒𝐮𝐴's expression and asked if everything was all right, sensing the tension. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 replied that they had managed to bring in a severely injured individual the night before, only to find him missing the next morning, leaving behind only a note. They had only been able to apply some burn cream before the individual vanished, which weighed heavily on 𝐒𝐮𝐴's mind. Izuku offered a sympathetic look as 𝐒𝐮𝐴 recounted the events of the previous night. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 then called out to Izuku, asking if he wanted a ride to UA to save him the walk. Izuku declined, stating that walking was good for his fitness. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 sighed, reminding him to be on time before leaving with his second coffee in the flask that he had begun to trust Izuku with. Once inside his apartment, Izuku felt a wave of relief as he removed his work uniform, the fabric no longer pressing against his burns. He had to keep tugging down his sleeves to conceal the injuries, hoping 𝐒𝐮𝐴 hadn't noticed. He retrieved his medical supplies, thankful for the full bottle of burn cream. After applying it, he knew he still needed to hide the burns, especially with physical training being a daily occurrence in the hero course. Izuku pulled out a tube of concealer, which he had saved for covering marks that could identify him. He knew it was expensive, primarily used by heroes to hide scars from battles, but this situation called for an exception. After about 10 minutes, the burns were nearly invisible, though the application stung. He quickly donned his uniform and left for school, waving goodbye to Natalie as he went. Upon arriving at his classroom, Izuku slipped in quietly and took his seat, waiting for their homeroom teacher. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 soon entered, announcing that they had something important to do, which made the students tense up, anticipating another expulsion test. However, he quickly eased their worries by stating they needed to elect a class president. He instructed them to choose someone by the end of homeroom before curling up in his sleeping bag for a light nap. The classroom erupted in chatter as students began discussing who should be president. Izuku wondered how 𝐒𝐮𝐴 could sleep through the noise, recalling that he was married to Present Mike, which likely made this seem quiet in comparison. Iida suggested a democratic vote, but a girl with pink skin and hair pointed out that everyone might just vote for themselves. Iida countered that whoever received multiple votes would be the most suitable candidate, and he quickly organized paper strips for everyone to write down their choices. As the votes were counted, Izuku was shocked to learn that he had received 6 votes, while Iida and Yaoyorozu received 2 and 3 votes, respectively. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 woke up just in time to announce that Izuku would be the president and Yaoyorozu the vice president. As congratulations poured in from his classmates, Izuku quietly asked who had voted for him. 5 hands were raised: Todoroki's, Iida's, Uraraka's, Azui's, and surprisingly, Tokoyami's, who had hardly spoken to him before. Izuku wondered who the 6th vote was and questioned why he had been chosen for the role. The bird-headed boy explained that they believed he was best suited for it, citing how he handled the training exercise, which had been chaotic. Izuku felt uncertain about the connection between their words and was relieved when their next teacher arrived, saving him from the awkward moment. During lunch, Todoroki, Iida, Uraraka, Azui, and Izuku sat together as usual. Iida, Uraraka, and Azui, who preferred to be called 𝐬𝐶, engaged in lively conversation while Izuku and Todoroki nodded and shook their heads as appropriate. It was an unusual dynamic, but it worked for them. Uraraka asked Izuku how he felt about being class president. He expressed his confusion about why they had voted for him, feeling unfit for leadership. When she reminded him that he had voted for himself, he clarified that he had actually voted for Iida, believing him to be the best choice. As he returned his gaze to his food, the conversation continued. Suddenly, alarm bells rang throughout the lunch hall, announcing a security breach. The robotic voice urged all students to evacuate to their homerooms. For a brief moment, there was stillness before chaos erupted, with students rushing toward the exits. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗟𝗘 shouted for everyone to stay together, but the crowd pulled them apart, leaving them unable to see each other. Izuku found himself curled up on the floor, hyperventilating as he struggled to calm down. The tight space, the crowd, and the loud noises overwhelmed him. Amid the chaos, another student noticed Izuku's distress and pushed through the crowd to help. He knelt beside Izuku, guiding him to follow his breathing pattern. Gradually, Izuku's breathing slowed, but he remained anxious due to the surrounding crowd. Ida, pressed against a window, caught sight of the reporters outside, realizing they were the cause of the commotion. Determined to calm the other students, he spotted 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗟𝗘 nearby and called for her to help him float above the crowd. She reached out, managing to tap his hand, and he levitated above the chaos. From his vantage point, he shouted for everyone to calm down, reminding them they were UA students and needed to act accordingly. Gradually, the crowd began to settle and move more calmly toward their classrooms. Once the crowd dispersed, Izuku expressed his gratitude to the boy who had helped him. The boy, Hitoshi Shinso, acknowledged the struggle of panic attacks. Izuku recognized him as Aizawa's adopted son, recalling how he often saw Shinso eating alone. The next day, Shinso joined their lunch table, becoming the newest member of their group. Aizawa, observing from the teacher's table, felt a sense of pride as he watched his son make friends. He had faced challenges in forming connections due to his quirk, but he believed these kids would be different. Unbeknownst to him, he smiled at the sight, prompting his husband to capture the rare moment with a photo. Unfortunately, the flash was left on, leading to a playful chase as Aizawa demanded the picture be deleted. Later in class, Izuku nominated Ida to take his place as class president, a decision that was well received by their classmates due to Ida's earlier display of leadership. As they left school, they discovered that the gate had been completely destroyed, allowing the press onto the grounds. While many blamed the reporters, Izuku felt a nagging suspicion that there was more to the security breach than just their presence. He would soon find out he was right. Not long after the UA gate had been destroyed and the press had gone wild, Class 1A was scheduled for a training exercise disguised as a school trip. The students were unaware of the true purpose of their outing, having only been informed that they were visiting the USJ, which many initially thought referred to Universal Studios Japan. They were mistaken. Aizawa was not that kind. Seated in a group across 3 pairs of seats were 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗟𝗘 and Ida, 𝐶 and Shinso, along with Izuku and Todoroki. Most of them chatted cheerfully about the upcoming surprise destination, while others listened and nodded or shook their heads in response. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗟𝗘 suggested with a hopeful smile that they might be doing something fun, but Izuku quickly pointed out that Aizawa likely wouldn't agree to such an activity, and the others nodded in agreement. 𝐶 then remarked on Izuku's apparent closeness with Aizawa, noting how he called him by his first name and brought him coffee regularly. Izuku explained that Aizawa was a regular at the cafe where he worked and that he considered him family, just like his boss Natalie, who was also his legal guardian. When 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗟𝗘 asked if he worked, Izuku shyly confirmed it, looking down at the ground, signaling that he preferred not to discuss it further. Ida speculated that it could be another test like the one they had experienced on their first day, a notion that the others considered. However, Izuku suspected it was more than just a test, especially since Aizawa had ordered extra coffee that morning, hinting at a more intense exercise that might require his involvement. As the group continued their conversation, Izuku struggled to find a comfortable position. His unhealed burns made it difficult to sit still, and he shifted uncomfortably throughout the journey. Todoroki, noticing Izuku's discomfort, caught his gaze for a moment, silently asking if he was okay. Izuku nodded quickly with a smile, grateful for the concern, while Todoroki returned to listening to the group's chatter, intrigued by his classmates. Eventually, the bus came to a stop, signaling their arrival. The students filed out in an orderly fashion, thanks to Ida, and stepped off the bus, gazing in awe at the tall dome before them. Aizawa's flat tone broke their reverie as he instructed them to get moving, leading them toward the structure. Inside, they observed the large area divided into different zones, each simulating various disaster situations. Izuku noted to himself that it was rescue training. Ahead, Pro Hero 13, who specialized in rescue missions, waved at them. Aizawa approached 13 and quietly inquired about All Might's whereabouts. 13 held up 3 fingers in response, prompting Aizawa to raise his eyebrows and sigh, muttering about the lack of surprises for the first years. Izuku wondered what that was about before focusing on the teachers addressing the class. 13 introduced themselves as the pro hero specializing in rescue training, explaining that many of them had quirks that could be destructive. This exercise was designed to teach them how to use their quirks to help others in need. Aizawa seemed ready to add something but was interrupted by Izuku, who pointed behind the pros, asking what that was. The two heroes turned to see a swirling purple mass emerging as a foot began to materialize from it. Aizawa immediately shouted for the students to stay back, declaring that this was not part of the exercise. Villains began to pour out of the gates, and Aizawa called to 13 to protect the students while he prepared to confront the emerging threats. The students watched in awe as their teacher engaged the villains, with only Izuku, who had seen Aizawa in action before, and Shinso, for obvious reasons, feeling less surprised. Izuku noticed one of the villains was enveloped in a purple mist, similar to the portal that had brought them here, leading him to wonder if it was a form of teleportation. Looking up, he saw the villains standing before the class, announcing that they were the League of Villains and that their goal was to destroy the symbol of peace, though it seemed he was not present. The villain inquired if they could reveal his location, noting that their information indicated he should be there. Izuku observed that the villain did not appear to have a visible physical body. If he does, it's likely hidden beneath all that mist, probably around where the neck guard is, Izuku theorized. 13 called out for the students to stay back before activating their quirk against the misty villain. Izuku shouted a warning, but it was too late. The villain had already opened a portal behind them, causing chaos. Bakugo and Kirishima charged at the man, but as Izuku had anticipated, they failed to leave even a scratch on him. The villain taunted the class, remarking on their efforts before opening gates beneath them. A few students managed to evade the portals, including Izuku. The mist villain returned to join the other villains, standing next to the one who seemed to be in charge, who was scolding him for allowing some students to escape. Ida had also avoided the portals and stood frozen in fear. Izuku called out to him, urging him to find a way through the doors and get help. Ida hesitated, insisting it would be unheroic to abandon his classmates. Izuku reminded him that they needed backup to save everyone, emphasizing that Shoyuda wouldn't last long against so many villains. With a firm resolve, Ida nodded and began to force open the door with Shuji's assistance, the only other student the warp gate had missed. Izuku then focused on the villains, particularly those who appeared to be in charge or especially dangerous. One had straggly blue hair and cracked skin, his body seemingly covered in hands. Another was the purple mist villain from before, with bright yellow eyes, and the last was a strange bird-like creature with bulging muscles. Below, Izuku noticed Aizawa taking down one of the remaining villains, clearly exhausted from the fight. Just as he prepared to jump down to help, the muscular creature appeared in front of Aizawa, grabbing his arm. An audible crack echoed through the facility as Aizawa's left arm broke, prompting a sharp gasp of pain from him. The man with cracked skin gleefully clapped his hands, instructing the creature to break Aizawa's other arm. The creature complied, snapping Aizawa's right arm as well. Aizawa struggled beneath the weight of the creature pinning him down, feeling his ribs give way under the pressure. Izuku leaped down and called out to the villain, catching his attention and causing the creature to momentarily release Aizawa. He challenged the villain, questioning the laziness of using a mindless creature to do his fighting. The villain, identifying himself as Shigaraki, retorted that he controlled the creature, which was merely the avatar he had chosen for this game. Izuku froze, falling to his knees as his vision blurred and his mind filled with agonizing memories. He felt trapped, the chains binding him once again, with no hope of escape. The scenery shifted to a nightmarish place he knew all too well. A figure emerged, causing him to scramble back in fear, its gleeful laughter echoing around him as he braced for pain. When he finally managed to ground himself, He saw the creature before him, arm drawn back to strike. Izuku rolled out of the way just in time, skidding across the floor before shakily getting back to his feet. With determination, he grabbed a knife from the hands of an unconscious villain nearby. His hands trembled, but he took a deep breath to steady himself, reminding himself that he needed to act. He recalled that without the creature's brain functioning properly, it had a major flaw he could exploit. Without hesitation, Izuku charged at the beast, aiming for its exposed brain, moving with precision. However, his knowledge of its anatomy wasn't enough to counter the creature's incredible speed. Its arm shot up in defense, and the knife sank deep into its dark flesh. Izuku quickly pulled the knife out and jumped back as the wound began to close, thankfully leaving his weapon intact. The 𝗏𝐽 prepared to attack once more with the same basic punching motion from earlier. Izuku delivered a swift kick to the beast's stomach, but the massive muscle didn't even flinch. He thought to himself that they had definitely made these creatures stronger. As he dodged an incoming punch, memories rushed through his mind, but he pushed them aside to concentrate. He needed information, but he couldn't use it if he was dead, could he? Pain shot up his arm, a reminder that it had been injured as he narrowly avoided a blow. He acknowledged the creature's increased strength once again as he took a deep breath, suppressing the pain to continue the fight. The two continued to exchange blows, with the 𝗏𝐽 missing most of its attempts as Izuku skillfully dodged. His attacks only seemed to count when he used his weapons. He had been relying on the predictable pattern of the beast's unvaried attacks to evade its moves, but he was slowly exhausting himself. It wasn't long before he was too fatigued to avoid a hit. He tried to raise his arm to block, but he was too slow. A jarring impact struck him square in the ribs, sending him crashing into the far wall of the facility. In the background, gleeful giggles echoed from Shigaraki, who was clearly saying something, but it all sounded like gibberish as Izuku's vision blurred and his ears rang. He could make out 𝗏𝗧𝗟 on the ground, a piece of rubble from his impact lying on top of him. The 𝗏𝐽 stood still, awaiting further orders. Izuku gathered his strength and decided to seize the opening. Despite his injuries, he managed to throw himself at the monster, landing directly on its head as it remained motionless. With a sharp inhale, he began to stab the creature repeatedly. Each move was fueled by his anger over the time he would have to spend recovering in a hospital bed. Eventually, he made the final stab, causing the creature to collapse with a final screech, seemingly defeated. As the world spun around him and his head felt light, Izuku shakily stepped off the creature's mutated body, managing a victorious grin in the direction of the childish man throwing a tantrum over his loss. Shigaraki began to scream accusations, pointing at him in disbelief. He couldn't comprehend how a pathetic little hero student could defeat the 𝗏𝐽, insisting that it was supposed to beat All Might. He scratched at his neck frantically, his frustration palpable. In the midst of Shigaraki's outburst, Izuku took the opportunity to steady himself, aware that he likely had a concussion. He needed to stay awake until the professionals arrived. There wasn't much else he could do in his condition. Aizawa struggled to pull himself from under the rubble, bewildered by how Izuku had managed to fend off the beast and knew to strike at its head. He wasn't going to let his student continue fighting while injured, but he wasn't in a position to stop him. Just as Aizawa was about to intervene, Izuku called out for help, recognizing another one of his students, 𝗧𝗟𝗟, who leaped over to assist. He instructed her to take 𝗏𝗟𝗟 to safety, as he was badly injured, assuring her he would follow closely behind. 𝗟𝗟 nodded and quickly removed the rubble from 𝗏𝗟𝗟, carrying him away just before the villain could regain his composure. Shigaraki managed to collect himself, though it was a semblance of composure for him. He resumed scratching at his neck, trying to process how the situation had unfolded. Suddenly, a realization struck him, and a wide smirk spread across his face. He had figured out the secret behind the brat's unexpected victory. He exclaimed with delight, laughing maniacally, reveling in the thought that Izuku had joined a hero school. He wondered what they would think if they knew the truth about him. As he finished his statement, the doors to the facility swung open, and pro-heroes rushed in to assist. Izuku's vision began to fade to black as the adrenaline that had sustained him wore off, and he felt the painful throbbing throughout his body. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was the man calling out a number. Izuku woke up with a sharp inhale, his mind foggy and his entire body throbbing painfully as he tried to understand what was happening. He eventually realized that he was likely on a stretcher, being transported to a hospital or to Recovery Girl. Either way, he needed to get out of this situation. Izuku had never been able to go to a doctor. The thought of a new patient being examined and discovering old bullet wounds on his body without any explanation was daunting. The last thing he needed was more attention on him. His classmates needed help more than he did. He could manage his injuries himself. He looked over at the nurse carrying him and explained that he wasn't badly injured, suggesting she assist one of his classmates instead. He insisted he could walk to the infirmary for a quick checkup. The nurse hesitated, but eventually nodded and helped him down from the stretcher. Once she saw he could walk, she seemed satisfied and left to assist other students who were in more urgent need of help. Izuku made his way to the infirmary, knowing he had to convince Recovery Girl that the scrapes and bruises on his arms and legs were his only injuries. He also had to worry about 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴. Convincing him would be more challenging than it had been with the nurse or Recovery Girl. They were professionals who understood what serious injuries looked like. If he concealed those signs, they would assume he was fine, having no reason to suspect a student would lie about having major injuries. 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴, however, was well aware of Izuku's tendency to downplay injuries. Especially after he had once handed him his coffee with a large burn on his hand that he tried to brush off as nothing serious. Entering the main school building, Izuku climbed a flight of stairs. After navigating a few turns and hallways, he stood in front of the infirmary, its massive door looming before him. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door creaked open, and a sweet old voice welcomed him in, noting that he had just come from the Izuku stepped inside and closed the door behind him, explaining that he was mostly fine aside from a few scrapes and bruises, and that he had been told to come down since it was mandatory after an attack like that. Recovery Girl assured him that those injuries were easily fixed as she used her quirk on him. Izuku felt his broken ribs and shattered arm begin to heal, sighing in relief and exhaustion. She advised him to go home and rest, explaining that her quirk used energy and that he would need all the rest he could get, especially with police questioning expected in the coming days. She handed him a handful of fruit gummies, telling him they would help. Gratefully, Izuku thanked her and left the infirmary, his steps unsteady as he fought to keep his eyes open until he reached home. Recovery Girl opened her computer and searched through the student database, finding Izuku's file suspicious. No last name, no previous school records, and signs of hidden injuries raised her concerns. She hoped her quirk had healed most of his injuries, having done as much as she could without causing harm. Izuku's walk home was a blur of passing cars and distant chatter. All he wanted was to sleep. It didn't take long for him to reach the cafe, and he went straight to his apartment. He would have greeted Natalie, but sleep was calling. Instead of heading to his bedroom, he flopped onto the couch, planning to tell her what happened later when she came looking for him after his shift. Around 3:30, his boss woke him up, asking if he was okay and joking that he could have just asked for a day off. Izuku lifted his head momentarily, mumbling about the villain attack, feeling too tired to elaborate. He quickly laid his head back down, and Natalie smiled fondly at him, gently running her fingers through his violet curls as he drifted back to sleep. At about 6 p.m., Izuku awoke again to find a note from Natalie. It read that he could explain everything tomorrow, urging him to rest and eat, mentioning that she had made soup for him. She informed him that the school would be closed for the next week and a half to allow students to recover fully. She insisted he stay in bed and warned him about consequences if she found out he went out. Checking his uniform, he noticed it was sticky with BLD. The waterproof blazer had kept most of it from soaking in, but his shirt was stained bright crimson underneath. Izuku peeled off his blazer and hung it on a coat hook, deciding to clean it later. First, he needed to tend to whatever Recovery Girl hadn't been able to heal. As he retrieved one of his many medical kits from the bathroom, he thought about how Recovery Girl's quirk had at least fixed his broken bones, realizing it healed whatever it could as best as possible. Once the box was open and set up on the counter beside the sink, Izuku peeled off his shirt, wincing with every movement until it lay in a heap on the ground. He cleaned his torso with a damp cloth to assess the damage, noting 4 large, partially healed gashes decorating his chest. Izuku looked at them in wonder, realizing they were the result of blunt force trauma, likely from when the creature had punched him into the wall. He shivered at the memory of the creature but quickly pushed those unpleasant thoughts aside as he returned to tending to his wounds. It took about an hour, but soon Izuku was all stitched up. It wasn't perfect, considering he wasn't a professional, but given how often he had done this for himself, they were quite good. He dealt with a few other minor cuts and scratches before tidying up his kit and heading to the kitchen. Inside the microwave, a pot of homemade chicken soup awaited him. He smiled slightly at the sight of a sticky note with a smiling face drawn on it. After heating the soup, he sat down on the couch to eat, reflecting on the events of the day before beginning to think about patrol. Any reasonable person would have called off patrol that night in favor of rest, especially with injuries needing time to heal. However, Izuku was not what most would call reasonable and had already planned out his patrol route, trying to avoid areas where 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐴 and Hawks typically patrolled. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard and risk his stitches coming undone. By the time he finished the bowl, the clock read 8 p.m., signaling it was finally time for him to patrol. He deposited the empty bowl in the sink, setting a reminder on his phone to wash it after patrol, and went into his room to retrieve his vigilante gear. He quickly changed, sliding his weapons into their holsters and ensuring everything was secure. Before leaping out of the window, he unzipped his costume under the hoodie and checked his stitches, relieved to find they were still intact. He leapt out of the window and onto the nearest building as usual. As he landed, Izuku grunted in pain, feeling his stitches strain and his body protest from exhaustion. He thought to himself that this was going to be annoying, but he braced for the discomfort and began his patrol with several more leaps between buildings. While he knew he should go home and rest, he felt responsible for the work he did and couldn't bear the thought of leaving someone in danger because he couldn't endure a little pain. Fortunately, luck was on Izuku's side that night, as it had been relatively quiet. So far, he had stopped a man cornering another in an alley and helped someone who had somehow gotten stuck in a bin. His stitches were holding up, even if they were becoming more uncomfortable with every passing minute. Most of his patrol had been spent leaping from rooftop to rooftop, keeping an eye out for trouble while listening to music on the old iPod he had recently added to his costume. Fighting bad guys was much cooler with a soundtrack. Izuku was nodding along to the music as he searched for trouble when Eraserhead spotted him. He was confused, as he usually would have been called out by the vigilante by now. He edged closer, still receiving no immediate reaction from the figure. He wondered what was going on as he noticed the earbuds in Izuku's ears and sighed, realizing he should have guessed. As the vigilante leapt to another rooftop, Aizawa prepared to catch up and follow but ended up standing and watching as Izuku landed awkwardly. He stumbled, landing flat on his face on the next rooftop, and Aizawa swore he heard the kid muttering under his breath as he pulled himself up. Aizawa was about to tease him for the mishap when he noticed Izuku trying to get up with a pained expression, clutching his chest. Concerned, Aizawa threw his capture weapon and jumped over to him. Izuku sprang up from the ground, greeting Aizawa as if nothing had happened. Aizawa waved back, asking where Hawks was. He explained that Hawks was needed elsewhere that night, being the number 3 hero and usually quite busy. Aizawa then reached into his capture weapon, pulling out a couple of jelly packets he always brought on patrol, knowing the kid didn't eat enough based on how baggy his costume looked. He tossed one to Izuku, who caught it, clearly puzzled by the gesture. Aizawa explained that he needed fuel for his nighttime activities. Izuku lifted his mask just enough for Aizawa to catch a glimpse of his lower face, noting the freckles that covered every inch of his visible skin. Aizawa made a mental note of this detail for the police files later. The two sat on the rooftop in comfortable silence for about 10 minutes, eating their jelly packets. Aizawa began to ask if Izuku was injured, but he was cut off as Izuku finished his packet and tossed it at him, hitting him in the face. Izuku called out his thanks and ran toward the edge of the building, yelling as he let himself fall backward. While anyone else might have panicked, he knew full well that Izuku was using his grappling hook. Even then, it was unsettling how easily he managed to leap from that building, not even a hint of hesitation. Aizawa thought to himself that this meant he was either reckless, suicidal, overly confident in his skills, or a mixture of all three. None of those scenarios were particularly good ones. If he was actually injured, Izuku suspected he had likely made the situation much worse. Unfortunately, he knew he would never find the vigilante unless the vigilante wanted to be found. With a sigh, he got up to continue his patrol. By 5 a.m., Izuku was back in his apartment, feeling a sense of pride despite the broken stitches he had. He had only ripped 3 of them in total, which were easily replaceable. Considering he had returned home with bullet wounds in the past, he felt he had done quite well. Those past experiences were the reason he had tiled the bathroom floor with brown tiles, so nobody would easily notice the stains left behind when he couldn't clean up properly. He had convinced Natalie that he had a bad cold, which was why he couldn't go into work with an injury. If the injury hadn't bled onto his uniform, he might have gone in anyway, but it seemed fate wanted him to keep living. After fixing up his stitches, Izuku changed into a regular outfit. It was around 6 a.m., and he needed to grab a few things before Natalie arrived to lecture him about his nearly empty cupboards. It was only a quick 15-minute trip, and he returned with a bag containing several microwave meals and a few tins. Upon opening the door, he found Natalie waiting for him on the couch, a stern look on her face. Guilt washed over him as he dropped the bag. Natalie stood up with a smile, walking toward him. About half an hour later, Izuku found himself duct-taped to his bed until further notice. Time passed, and after a week and a half off, Izuku announced to the class with his face practically mummified in bandages. The students cheered in response, and he continued, informing them that they would not be able to relax just yet. Confused looks spread across their faces, except for Shinso, who could see through Izuku's stoic act, and Izuku, who had known him long enough to understand. Izuku declared that the battle was not over, leaving them in suspense. Thoughts raced through the students' minds. Were the villains going to attack again? Were they in danger? Izuku then revealed that the school sports festival was coming up, urging them to train and do their best. He finished with a yawn, pulling out his familiar sleeping bag and bundling himself inside. He told them not to be too loud before completely submerging himself in the fabric cocoon. The class let out a collective sigh of relief. It was just the sports festival. In any other context, they might have been worried, but compared to a potential villain attack, they would take the sports festival any day. As the class began discussing their plans and training, Izuku, unbeknownst to them, was awake and listening. However, he wasn't particularly interested in their conversations. Instead, he was focused on a certain enigma he had known for more than 2 years without fully questioning anything about him, Izuku. There were many things that should have raised alarm bells. His lack of a last name on school records despite Natalie being his aunt and guardian, scars with suspiciously simple explanations, his constant anxiety around others, and his hardened combat skills that he refused to fully demonstrate. Izuku realized he needed to know more about this problem child before it was too late. He felt an urgency he couldn't explain, but he was determined to listen to it. Over the next 2 weeks leading up to the festival, the students trained hard outside of class. The sports festival was mainly a chance for them to push themselves and think of their own solutions rather than relying on guidance. Izuku trained physically with Uraraka and Ida outside of school and with Shinso in the school gym. Having been banned from work until after the festival, which Izuku had informed Natalie about, Izuku's real training happened during his vigilante hours. He began staying out until 5 a.m. every day, getting just an hour and a half of sleep before showering and leaving for school around 7:15, opting to walk the long way to kill some time before classes began. Soon, the sports festival was on the horizon, just one more day before he would compete against his classmates and fellow first-year students. Everyone had been training hard for the festival in hopes of claiming the first-place spot, except for Izuku. Izuku didn't particularly want to get stronger. He believed that the stronger one became, the more likely they were to hurt others. Although that wasn't entirely true at the moment, the lesson was deeply ingrained in him, etched into his mind where he could never forget it. He sat atop a building in his vigilante costume, catching his breath. Operating on just an hour and a half of sleep was challenging. He hadn't taken a day off to rest since Natalie had found him. Previously, he would dedicate a day every 6 months to sleep without any vigilante responsibilities. It had been quite a while since he last did that, especially after the sports festival when he knew they would have days off. He resolved to ask Natalie for a day off just to rest, especially if she wasn't already planning to insist on it. While he didn't think he needed much sleep, he recognized that he couldn't save others if he ended up collapsing from exhaustion. Earlier, he had met with Eraser and 𝗏𝗧𝗟𝗘, who had been appearing less frequently due to more destructive villains causing chaos in the larger parts of the city. Both heroes had lectured him about staying out late and the importance of rest, but their words never deterred him. He had been staying out later than Aizawa at times, which was quite an achievement since Aizawa only stopped working when absolutely necessary. Izuku had started emulating Aizawa by bringing a flask with him, filled strictly with coffee. Alcohol wasn't his style, and he appreciated having a fully functional liver while still a teenager. 𝗏𝗧𝗟𝗘 had jokingly referred to him as a mini eraser and had even suggested they were like father and son, which led to Izuku being playfully restrained with Aizawa's capture weapon to silence 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Despite the challenges, Izuku had been enjoying his time off from work. He still loved his responsibilities, but if every time Natalie insisted he take a break was like this, he wouldn't mind so much. The rest of his night was spent engaging in his usual activities, although he ventured slightly further than usual, adding a new area to his patrol routes due to the amount of trouble he found there. The crime rate had been steadily decreasing in his usual patrol area since he first appeared, so it made sense to expand his reach and create more safe spaces. He wondered how long it would take to eliminate crime in these areas to the point where the wealthier parts of the city would be worse off than the smaller ones. If that happened, he considered whether he should continue expanding into the larger cities. He pushed these thoughts aside as he made his way home at 5:03, realizing he was getting a bit ahead of himself. Once home, he flopped down into bed, ready to sleep while reviewing his plans for the sports festival. Izuku had meticulously prepared for the festival, knowing he couldn't show up empty-handed or he would appear to lack ambition. He didn't want Aizawa or Natalie on his case. Conversely, if he brought too much, expectations would rise, and he would risk irritating other competitors with an unfair advantage, forcing him to reveal more of his abilities. He needed to find a balance. His anti-gravity gauntlets, created using perfected technology, would serve this purpose. They functioned similarly to Uraraka's quirk but were less efficient, lasting only a few seconds. They were useful for boosting his jumps or floating small objects for a bit longer. He was already brainstorming ways to improve them, but he knew he wouldn't have time before the festival and had to work with the current design. Izuku aimed for 3rd place, not too high to spark controversy over a Quirkless student taking the top spot, but not so low that he would be dismissed or have Aizawa think he was slacking off again. It was the perfect balance, and he believed he could achieve it without raising suspicion. Based on his calculations of the first-year students participating, he figured Bakugo and Todoroki were the most likely to reach the finals, though he wouldn't be surprised if others made it that far. It wouldn't be hard to believe that a Quirkless student would lose against those two, even in Aizawa's eyes. He recalled the USJ incident, knowing Aizawa was present during the fight with the Nomu, but he was confident Aizawa hadn't seen his struggle, as he had been face down on the ground, pinned under rubble. He hadn't mentioned it to Aizawa, hoping his demeanor hadn't changed drastically enough to raise suspicion. Aizawa was the only one he needed to be cautious about when it came to revealing his strength, along with Principal Nizu. For all he knew, the principal could have already deduced his identity and capabilities, or he might not have. Nizu was the wild card, but given the lack of action, he either didn't know or had chosen to sit back and enjoy the show. Izuku hoped it was the latter. As the day of the festival arrived, all the classes gathered in the center of a massive stadium reserved for the event. Students from every course, from heroics to business, filled the space. There were more students from the heroics course than from other classes, mainly because the other courses didn't see the festival as relevant to their studies. The prevailing sentiment among them was that fighting other students in their year wouldn't help with their respective courses. There were exceptions, of course, particularly those hoping to transfer to the heroics course after failing the exam. Izuku felt a moment of hesitation about his decision to aim for 3rd place, considering the possibility that someone might transfer into the course they desired. However, he quickly resolved to stick with his plan when he noticed Aizawa's intense gaze from the announcing booth. He thought to himself that there was no backing out now as he let out a sigh and stretched his body to prepare for the first event. He had already informed Nizu and Aizawa that he would not be able to deliver the first-year address in front of the thousands in the stadium, and Bakugo had been called to take his place. Bakugo stepped onto the stage with an indifferent expression, simply declaring into the microphone that he would win before stepping back down. Most of Class 1A sighed at their classmates' typical behavior, many murmuring that they had expected nothing less. They turned their attention to Midnight, who was set to announce the first event. With enthusiasm, she called out that the first event of the UA Sports Festival would be the obstacle race, emphasizing her words with a WHP crack against the ground. She then instructed all participating students to make their way to the starting line. Izuku took a deep breath and began to follow the other students toward the starting line. It was finally time for the sports festival to begin.